The forest had teeth. Cale had known this since childhood when his grandmother whispered the old warnings. Never enter the blood pine thicket after dark. Never follow the pale lights that dance between the trees. Never trust the silence that feels like held breath. But desperation makes fools of even careful men. And winter had stretched its cruel fingers deep into the valleys this year. The deer were starving. The people were starving. And Cale, alone in his cabin with nothing but ghosts and regrets for company, had tracked a buck's prints into the one place sanity told him to avoid. The snow beneath his boots crunched with a sound like breaking bones. Each step sent small clouds of white powder into air so cold it burned his lungs. The pines stood black against the bruised purple sky, skeletal. Sentinels guarding secrets older than kingdoms. Their branches reached toward the dying light like clawed hands, and, in the spaces between them, shadows moved with purposes that had nothing to do with wind. Cale's breath misted before his face as he paused, bow drawn, eyes scanning the tree line. The buck's tracks had vanished 30 paces back, swallowed by unmarked snow as though the creature had simply ceased to exist. His instinct screamed at him to turn back. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory. The blood pine doesn't give up. What it takes, boy. It only trades life for life, soul for soul. He should have listened. That's when he saw her. At first, his mind couldn't process what his eyes were showing him. A shape, dark against darker stone, crumpled at the base of ancient ruins he'd never seen before. And Cale had hunted these woods for 15 years. The ruins thrust up from the snow like broken teeth. Black stone carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Architecture that predated any human settlement in these mountains. And there, collapsed against the entrance like a fallen angel cast from heaven's grace, lay a woman. She shouldn't have been beautiful. She should have been a corpse, her clothing torn and soaked with blood, her skin pale as moonlight on water, her dark hair matted and spread across the snow like spilled ink. But beautiful she was in the way that winter is beautiful. In the way that a blade is beautiful, terrible and perfect and absolutely wrong. Cale's hands tightened on his bow. Every hunting instinct he possessed shrieking predator danger. Run. But he didn't run. He took a step closer than another, drawn by something he couldn't name. Compassion, curiosity, or perhaps the simple human inability to abandon suffering when it wears a familiar face. As he approached, details emerged that froze the blood in his veins. Her clothing wasn't peasant wool or merchant silk. It was leather worked to impossible suppleness, dyed deep crimson and black with silver buckles that reflected the dying light like captured stars. Military. Ancient wrong. The blood pooling beneath her wasn't red. It was silver. Liquid. Silver, gleaming and viscous, seeping from wounds across her shoulder and ribs. Wounds that should have killed any human being instantly. The snow around her had melted in a perfect circle as though her body radiated heat despite the power of her skin. And where her blood touched the black stone, it seemed to sing a high crystalline sound at the very edge of hearing. God's mercy, Cale breathed, the prayer falling from his lips unbidden. He'd seen men die. He'd buried his wife with his own hands, watched plague take her piece by agonizing piece. He knew death intimately. But this was something else. Something that made the hair on his neck stand up, and his grandfather's old sword, worthless against wolves, but carried anyway, feel suddenly desperately inadequate. He knelt beside her, and the cold radiating from her body hit him like a physical wall. Not the cold of death. Something else, Winter Lake cold, ancient glacier cold. The cold of things that were never meant to warm. Her face was a portrait of suffering and otherworldly beauty. High Cheekbones, full lips slightly parted. Long lashes dark against cheeks too pale, too perfect. She looked 25 at most, but something about her felt old in a way that had nothing to do with years. Scars faint as spider silk traced patterns along her visible skin. The kind earned over lifetimes, not years. Don't touch her, his mind screamed. Walk away. Let the forest take her. Let winter be merciful. But Cale had stopped listening to wisdom the day he'd failed to save the one person who'd mattered most. His hand, rough and calloused from axe and bowring, reached out and touched her throat, searching for a pulse. Her eyes snapped open. They were black. Completely black. No whites, no iris, just pools of absolute darkness that reflected his terrified face back at him. And in those depths he saw things. Battlefields carpeted with bodies. Cities burning beneath blood-red moons. Centuries of violence compressed into a single moment of recognition. Then she blinked and they were brown. Deep dark brown. Almost human. Almost. Run, she whispered. Her voice like silk dragged across broken glass, melodic and ruined. Run while you still can, foolish man. Run before I. Her words cut off as her body convulsed, more silver blood bubbling from the wounds that split her flesh. Her hand shot out with inhuman speed, gripping his wrist with strength that should have shattered bone, but somehow restrained itself at the last moment. He felt her fingers, so cold they burned, press against his pulse. Point, and for a heartbeat, he thought she would tear his throat out. Instead, she whispered in a language he'd never heard, something ancient and fluid, beautiful and terrible. Then, in his own tongue, why? Why would you? Her eyes rolled back, consciousness fleeing, and her grip went slack. Cale sat frozen in the snow, his heart hammering so hard he could hear it, could feel it in his teeth. Every rational thought told him to stand up and walk away. She was dangerous. She was wrong. She was something out of his grandmother's darkest stories, the kind that ended with empty villages and songs about heroes who never came home. But beneath the fear, beneath the primal terror, he felt something else. Recognition. Not of who she was, but of what she carried in her eyes in that brief moment. Of consciousness. The same thing he saw in his own reflection every morning. Absolute crushing loneliness. The kind that comes from surviving when you should have died. The kind that comes from carrying weight no one else can see. The kind that makes you wonder if mercy is just another word for prolonging the inevitable. He made his decision without making it, his body moving before his mind could catch up. He shrugged off his heavy winter cloak and wrapped it around her blood-soaked form, noting with distant horror how light she was, too light, as though her bones were hollow like a bird's, as though she weighed no more than mist and moonlight. When he lifted her, she didn't wake, but her head lulled against his shoulder, and he felt her cold breath against his neck, shallow, irregular, wrong. The walk back to his cabin should have taken an hour. It took 3, not because of her weight, but because the forest fought him. The shadows between the trees deepened and moved against the wind. The temperature dropped until his breath froze midair and shattered like glass. Sounds followed them. Not wolves, but something else. Something that laughed with voices like rusted bells and whispered promises of what they'd do to him for stealing their prize. Twice he had to stop and draw his sword, standing over her unconscious form as shapes circled just beyond the tree line. Things with too many limbs and eyes that reflected red in the darkness. They never attacked. They just watched, waited as though they knew something he didn't. As though they pitied him. By the time his cabin came into view, a small, sturdy structure of logs and stone, smoke rising from the chimney from the morning's fire, the stars had emerged. Not the warm, gentle stars of summer, but the cold, distant stars of Deep winter, the kind that make you feel how small and fragile and temporary you really are. Cale kicked the door open and carried her inside, shouldering it closed behind him with enough force to rattle the windows. Only then, in the warm orange glow of firelight, did he truly see what he brought into his home. Silver blood covered his cloak, his hands, his chest, where she pressed against him. It gleamed in a firelight, like liquid starlight, and where it touched his skin, it tingled, not painful but present as though it were. Alive and aware and curious. Her face, framed by blood-matted hair, was even more impossibly beautiful in the warm light, and even more obviously not human. Her ears, mostly hidden by her hair, tapered to slight points. Her fingernails, though broken and torn, were almost claw-like, thick and black as obsidian. Her teeth visible through parted lips as she breathed those shallow, struggling breaths, included canines just a fraction too long too sharp, and beneath her torn clothing, he caught glimpses of more scars, more symbols. Some looked like brands, others like tattoos, all of them telling stories written in violence. He laid her on his bed, the only bed, the one he'd shared with his wife before plague had taken her 3 years ago, and began the work of trying to save something he didn't understand. As he cut away her ruined clothing, as he tried and failed to staunch wounds that wept liquid silver, as he watched her fever spike in her body convulse in ways that defied every bit of medical knowledge his grandmother had taught him, one thought echoed in his mind. I've just carried death itself across my threshold. Outside, the forest laughed its rusted bell laugh, and in the distance something howled, a sound of triumph or perhaps warning. Cale didn't know which would be worse. The fever should have killed her. Cale had seen plague fever before. The way it cooked people from the inside, the way it left them hollow and broken even if they survived. He'd held his wife's hand as she'd burned and frozen in cycles, had listened to her delirious prayers, had been helpless as life gutted out despite every herb, every pus, every desperate bargain with gods who'd stopped listening. This was different. This was impossible. The woman, he still didn't know her name, didn't know anything except that she was beautiful and bleeding and wrong, cycled through temperatures that would have killed any human within hours. One moment her skin would be burning hot, hot enough that touching her bare shoulder to change her bandages left red marks on his fingers. The next she'd be so cold that frost formed on her lips and her breath came out in crystalline clouds that tinkled when they shattered against the pillow. Through it all she never woke, but she spoke. Oh God, how she spoke. Languages Cale had never heard, fluid and harsh by turns, beautiful and terrible. Some sounded almost familiar, corrupted versions of the old tongue his grandmother had taught him, the one that predated the kingdom, the one that belonged to the first people. Others were completely alien, filled with sounds no human throat should be able to make, clicking consonants and vowels that seemed to have too many syllables that resonated in harmonics that made his teeth ache. But sometimes she spoke his language, and that's when Cale started to understand the magnitude of his mistake. The crimson vanguard breaks. At dawn, she whispered in a voice that carried the weight of command of someone used to being obeyed without question. Reform the left flank. Send the Thraws forward first. Let them break on our shields. Let them bleed. Cale paused and wringing out a blood-soaked cloth. He'd gone through a dozen already, each one stained silver despite his best efforts to clean her wounds. FRS. Vanguard. Terms from old stories from the wars his great-grandfather claimed to remember, but which everyone said were just legends. Inflated campfire tales. The blood-tide wars. When vampires and humans had slaughtered each other for a generation, when the nights ran red and entire cities went silent beneath blood. Moon skies. No, she can't be. Those are children's stories. But as he looked at her at the two sharp teeth, the silver blood that his herbs couldn't stop, the way her wounds were already starting to close with flesh that knitted itself back together like living thread, he couldn't deny what his eyes were showing him. "Sir, please," she whimpered, and this time her voice was smaller, broken, almost childlike. "Please don't make me do it again. They're just children." They're just her body convulsed, spine arching off the bed hard enough that Cale had to press her back down, his hands on her shoulders, feeling the unnatural strength coiled beneath her cold skin. "I won't. I don't care what you do to me. I won't." Then she screamed. It wasn't a human scream. It was the sound of something ancient and powerful being torn apart from the inside. A sound that vibrated in frequencies that made the cabin's windows crack, that made the fire in the hearth flare blue-green, that made Cale's bones ache with sympathetic agony. He clapped his hands over his ears, but it didn't help. The sound bypassed his ears entirely, resonating directly in his skull. When it ended, she collapsed back onto the bed, weeping. Not sobbing, not the ugly crying of pain and despair, but silent tears that rolled down her two pale cheeks and stained the pillow red. Red. Not clear. She wept blood. Cale's hands shook as he dampened a clean cloth and carefully wiped her face. The blood tears were warm, the only warm thing about her, and they left faint traces on her skin, like old stains that would never quite wash clean. Up close he could see more details. The scars he'd noticed before were extensive, covering most of her visible skin in a tapestry of violence. But they were old scars, silvered with time, perfectly healed. All except the fresh wounds, the ones currently seeping silver. Something had hurt her badly enough to cut through whatever supernatural resilience kept her alive. Something she'd been running from. "They're coming for me," she'd said before. "Passing out in the forest. Bar the doors. Trust nothing that bleeds." Cale stood abruptly and crossed to his cabin's small bookshelf. A luxury, but one his grandmother had insisted on. "Books are weapons," she'd said, "sharper than any sword if you know how to wield them." Most were practical herbalism, medicine, histories of the valley. But at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, were the old ones. The ones his grandmother had made him promise to never throw away, no matter how foolish they seemed. He pulled out a leather-bound tome, its pages yellowed with age, its cover stamped with symbols that looked uncomfortably similar to the ones carved into the ruins where he'd found her. Chronicles of the Eclipse. Kindred, the title read in script so old he could barely parse it. His grandmother had claimed it was a history, not a story. He'd never believed her. He believed her now. He flipped through pages filled with illustrations that made his stomach clench. Vampires depicted in brutal clarity, nothing like the romantic figures from southern ballads. These were weapons wearing human skin, beautiful and terrible, with eyes that reflected like animals and hands that ended in claws. The text described their hierarchy, lords and ladies, soldiers and servants, and above them all, the Warbrides. Cale's finger stopped on a page, his breath catching. "The Warbride is forged, not born. She is taken at the moment of death and remade. No longer woman, no longer fully vampire, but something between. A weapon with a woman's face. She leads the legions. She breaks the enemy. She is absolute in her purpose. A war bride does not question. A war bride does not feel. War bride exists only to serve her lord and to make the night run red with the blood of his enemies." Beneath the text was an illustration that made his blood run cold. A woman in crimson and black armor standing atop a mountain of bodies, her sword raised to a blood-red moon. Her face was beautiful and empty. her eyes reflecting nothing but death, and she was crying silver tears. Cale looked back at the woman in his bed, at her fever-flushed face, at the way her lips moved soundlessly around words he couldn't hear. Could she be? No. The blood-tide wars ended 70 years ago. His great-grandfather had been a boy when the last battles were fought, when the vampire lords retreated to their hidden courts and the humans reclaimed the daylight. The Warbrides were legends from that era, myths used to frighten children. But legends didn't bleed silver in his bed. Myths didn't whisper about vanguards and thaws and blood-soaked dawns. "Who are you?" he whispered to her unconscious form. "What did they do to you?" As if in answer, her eyes snapped open. Black again. Completely black, and her hand shot out, gripping his wrist with crushing strength. He cried out, feeling bones grind, feeling her nails pierce his skin. She pulled him close until their faces were inches apart, until he could see his reflection in those abyssal eyes, could smell her breath, cold, metallic, ancient. "They're coming," she hissed, her voice layered with harmonics. "That didn't belong to any human throat. Coming for me. Coming for you now. You touched me. You carried me. You chose mercy." Her grip tightened and Cale felt his wrist bones begin to crack. "Do you understand what you've done, little rescuer? You've painted a target on your soul. They'll tear you apart just to make me watch. They'll make it slow. They'll make it art. Then let me go." Cale gasped through the pain. "If I'm already dead. If no." And just like that, the blackness receded from her eyes, replaced by dark brown, human brown, and her grip loosened, became almost gentle. She stared at his bleeding wrist with an expression of absolute horror. "No, I didn't mean I can't control." She released him and turned away, curling into herself, trembling. "You should kill me right now while I'm weak. Take your sword and remove my head. Burn the body. Scatter the ashes. It's the only mercy left." Cale cradled his injured wrist, watching blood. His blood red and ordinary, well from the crescent marks her nails had left. The pain was sharp and immediate, grounding after the surreal nightmare of the past few hours. He should be terrified. He should be running. He should be doing exactly what she said. But all he could see was the way she'd curled into herself, the way her shoulders shook, the way she'd looked at his blood with horror instead of hunger. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. She went still. For a long moment she didn't answer. Then, in a voice so soft he almost missed it, "I don't remember what I was called before. After they remade me, I was Seraph, just Sarah. War brides don't need family names. We are who we're made to be." Seraph. He tested the name the way it felt in his mouth, sharp and soft at once, like a blade wrapped in silk. "I'm Cale." "I know." She still hadn't turned to look at him. "I read it in your blood when I touched you. Your name, your grief, your loneliness. It's one of the curses we taste. Everything, every memory, every pain. You lost someone. Your wife. The plague took her and you blame yourself because you couldn't save her." Now she did turn and her eyes were wet with more blood. Tears. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You know that grief. I'm sorry for everything I am and everything I've done. And I'm sorry that saving me has killed you." Before Cale could respond, before he could process the violation of having his deepest pain read like a book, a sound shattered the night. Howling, not wolves, not any natural creature. These howls were wrong, too rhythmic, too purposeful, carrying harmonics that made the cabin's walls vibrate. They came from multiple directions at once, surrounding the cabin, a chorus of predators announcing their presence. Sarada's head snapped toward the door, her expression transforming from broken to predatory in an instant. When she spoke, her voice carried that command tone again, absolute and cold. Bar the door. Iron if you have it. Salt across the threshold. Mirrors facing outward if you possess any. Do it now. Cale didn't question. He moved, his injured wrist forgotten, adrenaline singing through his veins. He dropped the heavy oak bar across the door, then grabbed a poker and wedged it beneath for good measure. Salt, his grandmother's voice again, always salt against the old things. He grabbed the container and poured a thick line across. The threshold, the windows, every possible entry. Mirrors. Sarah called from the bed. She tried to rise but collapsed, her legs refusing to hold her weight. They hate their reflections. It won't stop them, but it might slow. Have one. Just one. Cale grabbed the small hand mirror his wife had used, the only one he'd kept. He propped it facing the door, praying to gods he wasn't sure existed that it would be enough. The howling stopped. The silence was worse. Cale returned to the bed, drawing the old sword his grandfather had left him. Iron and ashwood, blessed by a priest, who'd probably been drunk at the time, absolutely worthless against anything with armor or competence, against supernatural creatures that wept silver and spoke in dead languages. He might as well have brought a stick. Seraph looked at him at the sword, and something flickered in her expression. Respect maybe, or pity. You'll die. Defending me, she said, not a question. Why? You don't even know what I am. What I've done. No, Cale admitted, positioning himself between her and the door, his heart hammering, his hands steady despite the terror. But I know what you didn't do. You could have killed me in the forest. You could have drained me when you grabbed my wrist just now. You didn't. He met her eyes. Saw the centuries in them, saw the sorrow. That's enough. For a moment, Sarah stared at him, and in that moment, Cale saw something shift behind her eyes. Something that might have been hope, or might have been the beginning of hope, fragile and dangerous as first ice over water. Then something hit the door. The oak shuddered in its frame. The bar held, but barely. Another impact and another rhythmic and purposeful. Whatever was outside wasn't trying to break through immediately. It was testing, learning the cabin's defenses, playing. A voice called out, male and smooth and wrong. Sarah the Scarlet, Sarah the Fallen, come out. Come out. Our Lord is disappointed. He gave you everything. Power, purpose, immortality, and you repaid him with betrayal. A laugh like glass breaking underwater. But he's merciful. He'll take you back. After you're properly corrected. Sarada's expression turned to stone. Bloodbound, she whispered. Sarah's dogs. He sent them to. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them they blazed with red light, with fury barely contained. He wants me dragged back in chains. Wants me to watch what they do to you first. Wants to break me by breaking everything. I cut herself off, but Cale heard the unspoken word care about. Another impact. Wood splintered. The bar cracked but held. Your choice, mortal. The voice called almost cheerful. Give her up and we'll make it quick. Die defending her and we'll take days. We'll make her watch every cut, every break, every scream. We'll be artists. Cale's hand tightened on his sword. His voice, when he spoke, surprised him. With its steadiness. She stays. Come through that door and you'll find out how creative a desperate man with nothing left to lose can be. Silence, then laughter. Multiple voices joining. In a chorus that sounded like hell's choir practicing. So be it. The assault began in earnest. And in the bed, Sarah wept tears of silver and red, whispering prayers to God she'd forgotten, begging forgiveness. She didn't deserve, while a mortal man she'd known for hours prepared to die defending her. The forest outside laughed its rusted bell laugh. The night had only just begun. They held through. The night, barely. By the time the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon, Cale's cabin looked like it had been mauled by some massive beast. The door hung from one hinge, split down the middle where something with impossible strength had punched through. The windows were shattered, salt lines broken, the mirror he placed as protection shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces. Blood, red and silver mixed together, stained the floor in abstract patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost beautiful in their horror. Cale sat with his back against the wall, his grandfather's sword across his lap, covered in blood that wasn't his own. His arms shook with exhaustion. His wrist, where Seraph had gripped him, throbbed with a deep ache that suggested more than just bruising. But he was alive. They were both alive. The bloodbound had retreated with the coming of dawn, their howls fading into the distance, replaced by the normal sounds of morning, birds, wind, the creek that ran behind the cabin. As if the night's horror had been a fever dream, something that couldn't survive daylight's cleansing touch. But the broken door said otherwise, the silver blood on his hand said otherwise. And Sarah, she stood at what remained of the window, staring out at the forest, with an expression carved from sorrow and stone. She'd risen from the bed sometime during the attack, moving with predatory grace despite her wounds, and had fought alongside him with a ferocity that had terrified him more than the creatures trying to break through. He'd watched her snap a bloodbound's neck with casual efficiency, watched her tear out a throat with her bare hands, watched her move with a speed that left after images a warrior, forged over centuries, beautiful and terrible as a blade fresh from the fire. And then, when the last of them had fled, she'd collapsed against the wall and wept. Now, in the gray morning light, Cale could see what he'd been too terrified to fully process before. Her wounds, the ones that had been weeping silver blood that should have killed any living thing, were gone. Not healed. Gone. The flesh had knitted itself back together, leaving only faint silver. Scars like thread traced beneath pale skin. Even as he watched, those scars were fading, her body erasing the evidence of injury with supernatural efficiency. "You're healing," he said, his voice rough from hours of shouting warnings from breathing air thick with violence. Yes, she didn't turn from the window. "By tomorrow night, I'll be at perhaps 60%. Another week and you won't be able to tell I was ever wounded." Her reflection in the broken glass showed a face too. Perfect, too still. "We heal from almost anything. It's part of the curse. We're very difficult to kill." Curse. Cale forced himself to stand, his legs protesting every movement. "You speak like immortality is a burden." Now she did turn, and her eyes, dark brown in the morning light, almost human, held depths of pain that made his soul ache. In sympathy. "Live long enough, mortal, and you'll learn immortality isn't life. It's just death taking its time." She crossed to the bed, moving with that inhuman grace, and sat with a weariness that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "I've lived 843 years. I remember empires that are dust. I remember languages no one speaks. I've forgotten more lives than you can imagine. Human lives, brief and beautiful, gone in what feels like moments." Her hands clenched on her thighs. "Everything I've ever loved has died. Everything I've ever built has crumbled. Everything except this." She gestured at herself, at her perfect, unchanging body. "This remains. Tell me, Cale of the lonely cabin, is that a gift or a curse?" Cale had no answer. He crossed to his small kitchen area, stepping over debris, and poured water from his reserve. The well was outside, and he wasn't quite ready to face what the dawn might reveal out there. His hands shook as he filled 2 cups, offered one to Sarah. She took it, with a small, sad smile. "You're still offering me hospitality. After everything you've seen, everything you know now." She sipped the water and he noticed she held the cup gently, consciously moderating her strength. Most would be running or trying to kill. Me. You're either the bravest man I've met in centuries or the most foolish. Maybe both. Cale drank the water, cutting through the metallic taste of fear and adrenaline. You could have left. When they came for you, you could have run. Left me to whatever mercy they'd show. You didn't. There's no mercy in the bloodbound. Sir's soldiers know only obedience and cruelty. If I'd run, they would have torn you apart just to make a point, just to send a message. Her jaw clenched. He's always been fond of messages, of lessons. Sir. Cale remembered the name from her fever dreams. The way she pleaded with someone who wasn't there. Who is he? Sarada's expression closed like a door, slamming shut. For a long moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, as if each word cost her, "He was my maker. My lord, my," she choked on the word, "my everything. Once upon a time, he found me dying on a battlefield 800 years ago. The blood-tide wars were young then, just beginning, and I was a human soldier who'd made the mistake of being competent. Useful. Sir doesn't waste useful things." She stood abruptly, pacing the small cabin like a caged wolf. "He turned me. Not out of love. Vampires don't love. Not the old ones. Not really. But out of possession. He saw something in me. Some quality he wanted to own. So he made me his, fed me his blood, killed me, brought me back." As she gestured at herself, disgusted thick in her voice. This his war bride, his weapon, his perfect obedient tool to break his enemies and expand his territory. "But you're not obedient," Cale said quietly. "You refused him. That's why they're hunting you." "I refused him." She laughed, bitter and broken. "Do you know how long it took me? 700 years. 7 centuries of being exactly what he made me. A killer without conscience, a general without mercy. I led his armies. I burned human cities. I made the night run red with blood and thought nothing of it because I was nothing. Just a weapon with a woman's face." She turned to face him and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "And then 100 years ago, he ordered me to take the city of Grey home. 5,000 souls. Men, women, children, not because they were a threat but because they dared to petition for peace. He wanted to make an example." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I stood at the gates with my legion behind me. I could have done it. I'd done it before dozens of times. But I looked at those walls, at the lights in the windows, and I heard singing, children singing. And something in me, some tiny piece of the woman I'd been 800 years ago, woke up. And I said, no." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of that single word. No. Such a small word to carry such consequences. "He declared me traitor," Sarah continued, her voice empty now. "Stripped me of my command, sent hunters. First the bloodbound, then worse. I've been running ever since. A century of hiding, of fighting, of trying to atone for 7 centuries of sin." She met Cale's eyes. "So when you ask who Sir is, the answer is simple. He's my creator, my tormentor, and the reason everyone I've tried to help since my rebellion has ended up dead. He doesn't forgive. Cale, he doesn't forget. And now that he knows you helped me, you're on his list too." Cale should have felt fear, should have felt anger at being dragged into a conflict older than his kingdom, a war between creatures he thought were myths. Instead, he felt something else, recognition, because he understood what it meant to carry guilt, to wake every morning with the weight of failure, to wonder if redemption was even possible. He'd failed his wife, failed to save her from plague, failed to be enough, to do enough, to love enough to keep death at bay. The grief had driven him into these woods, into isolation, into a half-life of hunting and silence. But Sarah carried guilt on a scale he couldn't imagine. 800 years, centuries of death staining her hands. And she was still trying to atone, still fighting to be something more than the weapon she'd been forged to be. You mentioned Grey Home, Cale said slowly. The city you refused to destroy. Yes. She turned back to the window, watching the sunrise with an expression of longing. Vampires couldn't face direct sunlight, he remembered from the old texts. But the gray dawn light seemed to cause her no pain. It stands still. Thriving, actually. One of the southern kingdom's merchant hubs. 5,000 souls. That became 10,000 because I said no. Then you did save them. You chose mercy. Even when it cost you everything. Cale crossed to stand beside her carefully, giving her space to retreat if she wanted. She didn't. That's not a weapon, Sarah. That's a person. A person with more courage than anyone I've ever met. She looked at him, then really looked, and he saw the centuries in her eyes. All the pain, all the death, all the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, she could be more than her worst moments. You're a fool, she whispered. A beautiful, doomed fool. And I'm going to get you killed. Maybe. Cale smiled, surprising himself. But I've been half dead for 3 years. Maybe it's time I had something worth dying for. Before Sarah could respond, before the moment could stretch into something more dangerous than the previous night's attack, a sound cut through the morning air. Howling again, but different this time, more distant, more controlled. Not the bloodbound's chaotic assault, but something organized. Something worse. Sarah's expression turned grave. They're regrouping. Calling reinforcements. The bloodbound are shock troops meant to overwhelm quickly. If they failed, she trailed off listening to harmonics. Cale couldn't hear. He sent a lieutenant. Someone with authority. Someone who won't stop with Dawn. Can we run? Cale asked, already knowing the answer. Where? I've been running for a century. Cale. He has resources beyond your imagining. Spies in every shadow. Agents in every court. Human and vampire. There's nowhere he can't reach. Nowhere. She stopped abruptly, her eyes widening. Unless. She turned to him. And for the first time since he'd found her bleeding in the snow, he saw something other than sorrow in her expression. He saw hope. Dangerous, desperate hope. The deep ruins. The ones where you found me. They're older than Sir. Older than the blood tide wars. They're from the First Covenant era when humans and vampires made peace before everything fell apart. Her words came faster now. Urgent. The temple there is neutral ground, sacred to both sides. Even Sir wouldn't violate those sanctuaries. There are consequences for breaking the old laws, things even the ancient vampires fear. So we hide in a ruin and hope ancient magic protects us. Cale's voice was skeptical, but he was already moving, already gathering supplies, his bow, his knife, dried meat, and water skins, the few possessions that mattered. No, we find the weapons that were left there. Sarah moved with purpose now, pulling on what remained of her torn clothing, layering on one of Cale's cloaks. Despite the incongruity, the First Covenant wasn't just a treaty. It was backed by power. Artifacts from an age when vampires and humans fought together against something far worse than each other. If even one of those artifacts remains, she met his eyes. We might have a chance. not to run, to fight. Cale paused in his gathering, a question burning in his mind. What did vampires and humans fight together against? What could be worse than the blood-tide wars? Sarah's expression went distant, troubled. Old things. Older things. The stories are fragmented, even among my kind. Things that existed before humans, before vampires, before the world took its current shape. Things that sleep beneath stone and sea, waiting for the stars to align correctly. She shook her head. But they're sleeping still, or we'd know. The first Covenant artifacts were forged to fight them, which means they're powerful enough to hurt even an ancient vampire like Sir. She crossed to him, placed her cold hand over his warm one. I'm asking you to trust me. I know I've given you every reason not to. I know what I am, what I've done, but I'm asking anyway. Will you trust me? Will you come with me into those ruins, knowing we might not come back out? Cale looked at her hand on his at the contrast, her pale, perfect skin against his scarred, calloused flesh. Life and death, warmth and cold, mortality and eternity. He thought about his wife, about the promise he'd made at her grave to never care enough to be hurt again. He thought about the 3 years of safe, empty isolation in this cabin. And he thought about Sarah, weeping silver. Tears in his bed, whispering apologies to ghosts 800 years old, still trying to be more than the weapon she'd been made to be. Yes, he said simply. I'll trust you. Something in her expression cracked just slightly, the stone warrior facade fracturing to reveal the person underneath, the one who'd survived 800 years of horror and still somehow retained the capacity for gratitude, for relief, for something that might be the beginning of joy. Then we need to go now, before a crash from outside. Not the door this time. Something bigger. Something that made the cabin's remaining walls shake. Made dust rain. From the rafters. Through the broken window, Cale saw something that made his blood freeze. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, tall and beautiful and absolutely terrifying. Male with features too perfect to be human, dressed in black leather and crimson silk that matched Sarada's ruined clothing. His hair was long and silver white, his eyes reflecting red even in the daylight, and around him the very air seemed to bend, shadows pooling at his feet despite the morning sun. He smiled, and it was the smile of a predator that knows it's already won. Saruth, my wooed star, he called, his voice carrying effortlessly across the distance, beautiful and terrible as a funeral bell. Did you really think the bloodbound were all I'd send? Did you truly believe I wouldn't come myself to reclaim what's mine? Beside Cale, Sarah whispered a single word, heavy with dread and ancient fear. Sir, the nightmare had arrived, and the morning offered no sanctuary at all. Sir didn't attack immediately. That was somehow worse. He stood at the edge of the clearing like a dark king surveying a conquered province, his presence alone making the air feel thicker, colder, wrong. Behind him, shapes moved in the tree line, bloodbound, dozens of them, waiting for orders with the patient stillness of trained killers. But Sir himself simply waited, watched as if he had all the time in the world because he did. Cale's hands shook as he gripped his bow. Arrow knocked, knowing full well how useless it would be. Beside him, Sarah had gone absolutely still, every muscle locked, her breathing shallow. Not fear exactly, something deeper, something that lived in the marrow of her bones. 800 years of conditioning, screaming at her to kneel, to submit, to return to the role she'd been shaped to fill. You've led me on quite a chase, my dear. Sir's voice carried that terrible beauty, melodic and sharp as a blade across silk. Century of hiding, of scurrying through shadows like common prey. I must admit, I found it disappointing. Where is the warrior who broke the southern clans? Where is the war bride? Who made kings tremble? She learned to say no to monsters, Sarah called back, her voice steadier than Cale expected. Something you never taught her. No, I taught you purpose. He took a step forward and the shadows followed, spreading like oil across the snow. Gave you meaning in a meaningless existence, direction, power, and you repaid me with betrayal. With this, he gestured at Cale with casual contempt. This pathetic mimicry of human compassion. Tell me, do you think playing at mercy will erase 7 centuries of blood? Do you think caring will balance the scales? I don't, Sarah said quietly. Nothing can balance those scales. But I can stop adding to them. Sir laughed and the sound made Cale's teeth ache. How beautifully naive. You think you can. Stop. Seraph, you are a weapon. Weapons don't retire. They serve or they're destroyed. There is no third option. Then destroy me. Sarah stepped forward, placing herself between Cale and Sir, her body language shifting into something predatory, dangerous. Come, my lord and maker. Show me how much you value your perfect weapon. See if I break as easily as you remember. For the first time something flickered across Sria's perfect features. Surprise, maybe, or interest. You would fight me. You still weak from your wounds, cut off from your power base, with only a mortal hunter as your backup. He tilted his head, genuinely curious. Why? What is this man to you that you'd throw away even a slim chance of survival by running? Sarah didn't answer. Immediately. When she did, her voice carried a weight that made Cale's chest tighten. He showed me mercy when I was helpless. He defended me when monsters came for me. He trusted me when every instinct told him to run. In 3 days he's given me more genuine kindness than I received in 700 years of being yours. She drew herself up, and even wounded, even facing impossible odds, she looked every inch the legendary war bride. So yes, I'll fight. I'll lose probably. But I'll lose choosing to protect something good, rather than being your obedient butcher. Silence fell across the clearing. The bloodbound shifted in their hiding places, waiting. Sir stared at Sarah, with an expression Cale couldn't read. Anger certainly, but beneath it something else. Something that might have been grief or loss or the closest thing to hurt a creature like him could feel. I see. Sir's voice had gone soft. Dangerous. He's not just your latest charity project. He matters to you. How unexpected. His smile returned sharp and cruel. Very well. I'll make you a deal, Sarah. The same deal I've made before when you grew too attached to your mortal pets. No. Sarah's voice cracked with sudden panic. You returned to me willingly. Resume your position as my war bride, and I'll let him live. Sir gestured gracefully at Cale. I'll even sweeten the terms. I'll guarantee his protection. No vampire under my banner will touch him. He can live his pathetically brief mortal life in peace, growing old, forgetting you, dying, surrounded by grandchildren who'll never know how close they came to never existing. You're lying. Sarah breathed. You always lie. Am I? Let's ask him. Sir's red eyes fixed on Cale, and the weight of that gaze was like being crushed beneath a mountain. Mortal Cale, isn't it? Would you have her sacrifice her freedom for your life? Would you have her return to being a weapon to slaughtering innocents just so you can continue your meaningless existence? Cale's throat was dry. Every instinct screamed at him to agree, to beg Seraph to take the deal, to let him die rather than return to slavery. But he looked at her, at the way she stood rigid with dread, at the centuries of pain carved into her expression, and knew what his answer had to be. No, he said, his voice rough but clear. I'd Rather die free beside her than live knowing I was the chain that dragged her back into hell. Sitha's expression went cold. How tediously noble and ultimately pointless. He raised his hand and a bloodbound began to emerge from the trees. A tide of twisted flesh and loyal madness. Weapons drawn. Very well. If you won't come willingly, I'll drag you back. And I'll make sure your mortal dies slowly enough that you feel every moment through whatever bond you foolishly established with him. There's no bond. Seraph lied quickly. Please, I taught you to create Thraws, my dear. I can smell your essence on him. Taste it in the air. Sir's smile turned vicious. How desperate you must have been to bind yourself to something so fragile. When he dies, and he will, you'll feel it. Like losing a limb, like having your heart carved out while still beating. It will be exquisite. The bloodbound charged. 20, 30, maybe more. Kale lost count as they poured from the trees. Weapons raised. Voices raised in howls that shouldn't come from anything with a human throat. He drew his bow, loosed an arrow that took one in the eye. They could still die, he remembered. Just not easily reached for another. Sarah moved. She was still wounded, still weak by her standards, but she was still 800 years of honed combat instinct wrapped in supernatural speed and strength. She became a blur of motion, her hands empty, but her body a weapon itself. Snapping necks, crushing throats, using momentum and leverage to turn the bloodbound's own strength against them. Beautiful and terrible, a dance choreographed in violence, every movement efficient and brutal. Kale did what he could. Arrows finding eyes and joints, the few weak points these twisted things had. His grandfather's sword flashing out when they got too close. More luck than skill keeping him alive as blood-bound claws scraped across his ribs, his shoulder, leaving burning lines of pain. He'd been a hunter, not a warrior. This was so far beyond his experience, it might as well have been a different world. But he didn't run. He stood his ground, fighting beside Sarah, protecting her back as she protected his. And in the chaos of blood and violence, something crystallized between them, trust, absolute and unquestioning. The kind that can only be forged in fire. A bloodbound got through, claws aimed at Kale's throat. Sarah was there, impossibly fast, taking the blow. Meant for him, her arm opening in silver blood. She didn't even flinch, just drove her other hand through the creature's chest and ripped out something that might have been a heart. Kale returned the favor seconds later, his arrow finding the eye of a bloodbound that had leaped at Sarata's back, bringing it down in a thrashing heap. They were going to lose. There were too many, and more kept coming, and Sir still stood at the edge of the clearing, not even participating, just watching with that terrible patience. But they were going to lose together, fighting, choosing how their story ended. Then Sarah screamed, not in pain, but in command, in a voice that carried harmonics of pure power. Stand down. And the bloodbound froze. Not all of them. Maybe half. But that half stood stock still, their eyes glazing over, their bodies going rigid. Kale realized with shock that they were responding to her voice, to whatever authority she'd held before her exile. Even turned against her, even loyal to Sir, some deep conditioning remained. Sarah pressed the advantage, grabbing Kale's arm and running, using her supernatural speed to half-drag carry him across the clearing, not toward the road, toward the forest, toward the blood pine thicket, toward those ruins where ancient magic might offer sanctuary. Behind them, Sir's laughter rang out, amused rather than angry. Run, my star. Run to your temple. Well, follow. We have all the time in the world. They plunged into the trees, branches whipping at Kale's face, snow spraying beneath their feet. Sarah moved with impossible grace, even while pulling him along, knowing paths through. The blood pine that he'd never seen, that maybe hadn't existed before she'd come this way. The forest bent around her, responding to something in her presence, in her ancient nature. The temple, she gasped, and even her voice was labored now. The fight and the flight taking their toll. Just a little further, the bloodbound won't follow us inside. Sir might, but the old laws, they'll bind even him. Cale's lungs burned. His legs screamed for rest. His blood, red and ordinary, soaked his shirt from a dozen cuts. But he kept running because stopping meant death, meant watching Sarah dragged back into slavery, meant everything he'd chosen in the past 3 days becoming meaningless. The ruins appeared through the trees like a dark miracle. Black stone rising from white snow, symbols glowing faintly with power he could almost see. The same place he'd found her bleeding 3 days ago, a lifetime ago. She was still wounded, still weak by her standards, but she was still 800 years of honed combat instinct wrapped in supernatural speed and strength. She became a blur of motion, her hands empty, but her body a weapon itself, snapping necks, crushing throats, using momentum and leverage to turn the bloodbound's own strength against them. Beautiful and terrible, a dance choreographed in violence, every movement efficient and brutal. Cale did what he could, arrows finding eyes and joints, the few weak points these twisted things had. His grandfather's sword flashing out when they got too close. More luck than skill keeping him alive as blood-bound claws scraped across his ribs, his shoulder leaving burning lines of pain. He'd been a hunter, not a warrior. This was so far beyond his experience it might as well have been a different world. But he didn't run. He stood his ground, fighting beside Sarah, protecting her back as she protected his. And in the chaos of blood and violence, something crystallized between them, trust, absolute and unquestioning. The kind that can only be forged in fire. A bloodbound got through, claws aimed at Cale's throat. Sarah was there, impossibly fast, taking the blow. Meant for him, her arm opening in silver blood. She didn't even flinch, just drove her other hand through the creature's chest and ripped out something that might have been a heart. Cale returned the favor seconds later, his arrow finding the eye of a bloodbound that had leaped at Sarata's back, bringing it down in a thrashing heap. They were going to lose. There were too many, and more kept coming, and Sir still stood at the edge of the clearing, not even participating, just watching with that terrible patience. But they were going to lose together, fighting, choosing how their story ended. Then Sarah screamed, not in pain, but in command, in a voice that carried harmonics of pure power. Stand down. And the bloodbound froze. Not all of them, maybe half, but that half stood stock still, their eyes glazing over, their bodies going rigid. Cale realized with shock that they were responding to her voice, to whatever authority she'd held before her exile. Even turned against her, even loyal to Sir, some deep conditioning remained. Sarah pressed the advantage, grabbing Cale's arm and running, using her supernatural speed to half drag, half carry him across the clearing, not toward the road, toward the forest, toward the blood-pine thicket, toward those ruins where ancient magic might offer sanctuary. Behind them, Sitha's laughter rang out, amused rather than angry. Run, my star. Run to your temple. Well, follow. We have all the time in the world. They plunged into the trees, branches whipping at Cale's face, snow spraying beneath their feet. Sarah moved with impossible grace, even while pulling him along, knowing paths through the bloodpine that he'd never seen, that maybe hadn't existed before she'd come this way. The forest bent around her, responding to something in her presence, in her ancient nature. The temple, she gasped, and even her voice was labored now. The fight and the flight taking their toll. Just a little further. The bloodbound won't follow us inside. Sir might, but the old laws they'll bind even him. Cale's lungs burned. His legs screamed for rest. Blood. His blood, red and ordinary, soaked his shirt from a dozen cuts. But he kept running because stopping meant death, meant watching Sarah dragged back into slavery, meant everything he'd chosen in. The past 3 days becoming meaningless. The ruins appeared through the trees like a dark miracle. Black stone rising. From white snow, symbols glowing faintly with power he could almost see. The same place he'd found her bleeding 3 days ago. A lifetime ago. They crashed through the entrance, and the moment they crossed the threshold, something shifted. The air grew warmer, thicker, charged with invisible energy. The sounds of pursuit, howls, footsteps. Sriya's mocking calls grew muffled, distant. Sarah collapsed against a pillar, sliding down to sit in the ancient dust, her breathing ragged. The wound on her arm, the one she'd taken protecting Cale, wept silver blood that pulled on the stone floor. But she was smiling, fierce and triumphant. "We made it," she breathed. "The temple recognizes me. Old magic. From when I was still trying to be good." Cale sank down beside her, his back against the same pillar, their shoulders touching. Outside, shapes moved in the trees, circling but not approaching. The bloodbound, held at bay by ancient power. And beyond them, a figure in black and crimson, watching with red eyes that promised this was far from over. But for now they were safe. For now they were alive. For now they had each other. Sarada's head lulled onto Cale's shoulder, her cold skin against his warm neck, her breath stirring his hair. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry I dragged you into this." Cale, exhausted and bleeding and more alive than he'd felt in 3 years, smiled. "I'm not." And in the ancient temple, surrounded by enemies with death waiting just beyond the threshold, they sat together in the silence that was somehow more intimate than words. Outside, Sir watched and waited and planned. He had all the time in the world. The temple remembered gods older than thirst. Inside its walls, the temperature normalized, not warm exactly, but not the biting cold that had stalked them through the forest. The black stone seemed to absorb sound, creating a stillness so complete that Cale could hear his own heartbeat, could hear Sarada's slower, irregular pulse beside him. Light filtered through cracks in the ancient ceiling, pale and silvery, touching walls carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. They'd made it perhaps 50 foot inside, before collapsing. Now, as his breathing slowed and adrenaline faded, Cale could actually see what they'd taken refuge in. It was magnificent. The entrance chamber stretched high. Above them, vaulted ceilings supported by pillars carved to resemble trees. Not mortal trees, but something older. Something with roots that dug deeper than stone and branches that reached toward stars that no longer existed. Between the pillars, murals covered every surface, faded with age, but still visible. Scenes of humans and vampires, standing side by side, fighting against shapes that made Cale's eyes slide away when he tried to focus on them. Battles beneath crimson moons. Peace negotiations around tables heavy with scrolls. And everywhere the same symbol, a sun and moon overlapping, creating a corona of light and darkness intertwined. The first covenant. I'd forgotten how beautiful it was, Sarah whispered beside him. Her voice carried reverence, something almost like worship. "I came here once centuries ago when I was young for my kind. Before Sir's grip tightened, before I stopped believing in anything but survival." She struggled to stand, and Cale immediately moved to help her, his arm around her waist, her arm across his shoulders. She leaned into him, her weight barely anything despite her height. There's more. Deeper. The sanctum is below. That's where. She trailed off and Cale followed her gaze to the far end of the chamber. A doorway smaller than the entrance carved with symbols that seemed to pulse with faint light. And beside it, text and languages he couldn't read. But as he stared, the symbols seemed to shift, rearrange, becoming readable. Here lie the weapons of the final alliance. Forged in desperation, blessed by necessity, to be taken only when the old dark rises again, when the sleepers stir, when the covenants of sun and moon stand ready to break the final alliance. Cale read. Aloud. What did they fight? Sarah's expression grew distant. Haunted. The stories are fragmented. Even among the eldest vampires, the ones who remember the First Covenant era, there's disagreement. Some say ancient gods, jealous of mortal and immortal cooperation. Some say elder things from beyond the stars, creatures that existed before creation itself. Others claim it was simply entropy, the universe's natural tendency toward darkness given form and hunger. She moved toward the doorway and Cale matched her pace, supporting her. Whatever they were, they nearly won. The First Covenant wasn't a treaty of convenience. It was born from apocalypse. Humans and vampires hated each other even then, but they hated extinction more. So they worked together, created weapons, performed rituals, and somehow miraculously they won. Sealed the enemy away. And then turned on each other. Cale finished grimly. And then turned on each other, Sarah agreed. Within a generation, the memory of what they'd fought together became legend. The next generation called it myth. By my time, she shook her head. The blood-tied wars were fought because no one remembered why peace mattered. We'd forgotten the enemy that made us allies. So we became each other's enemies instead. They passed through the doorway, descending stone steps worn smooth by ancient feet. Human and vampire both, Cale realized, seeing the different sizes etched into the stone. The temperature dropped as they descended, but it wasn't the hostile cold of winter. It was the cold of deep places, of spaces untouched by sun for millennia, preserved rather than abandoned. The stairs opened onto a chamber that stole Cale's breath. It was a sanctum, clearly a place of worship or power. The two interchangeable to ancient peoples. The ceiling here was painted to resemble a night sky. Stars picked out in silver and gold that seemed to actually glow, creating a twilight that let them see without torches. And around the walls in a loves carved, with reverent care, set the artifacts. Weapons, yes, but not crude instruments of death. These were crafted, beautiful and terrible. A sword that seemed to be forged from solidified starlight, a bow strung with what looked like woven moonbeams, a staff topped with a crystal that held captured dawn. Other things, too, a chalice carved from a single massive gemstone, armor that seemed to be made of shadow-given substance, shields bearing the covenant symbol. But it was the center of the room that drew Sarada's attention. A pedestal, simple black stone, holding a single dagger. It was unadorned, no jewels, no elaborate hilt, just a blade. Perhaps 8 in long, made from metal that Cale couldn't identify. It seemed to shift between silver and gold, depending on the angle of the light, and along its edge ran symbols that matched the ones at the entrance. Sarah approached it like a pilgrim approaching a shrine, her movements slow, reverent. The dawn blade. She whispered. I'd heard stories, but I never thought. She reached out, hesitated, her hand trembling. Do you know what this is, Cale? What it can do? Cale shook his head, transfixed by the weapon. It was beautiful and terrible, and looking at it made something in his chest ache with a feeling he couldn't name. Not fear, but something adjacent to it. Awe, maybe, or dread. Vampires. Draw power from bloodlines, Sarah explained, her voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting ancient lore. When we're turned, we inherit a connection to our maker and through them to their maker all the way back to the first vampires, the originals. That connection is our strength, our immortality, our magic. We are never alone. We're always linked to our bloodline, drawing from it, feeding it in turn. She finally touched the blade and her fingers came away unmarked. The Dawn blade was forged to sever that connection, to cut a vampire free from their bloodline, isolating them. Without that connection, we're still supernatural, still stronger than humans, still harder to kill, but we lose our oldest powers, our deepest magic. An ancient vampire cut by this blade would be reduced to something barely more than immortal. Still functional, still alive, but diminished. That's why you came here, Cale understood. You want to use this against Sir. It's the only weapon that could hurt him. He's over 2,000 years old. Cale, 20,000. His bloodline reaches back to the first of our kind, to creatures that walked the earth when humans were prey animals cowering in caves. He's beyond anything I could fight conventionally even at my peak. She lifted the Dawn blade, testing its weight. But this could level the field. What's the cost? Cale asked. Because there was always a cost. He'd learned that much in his short, painful life. Power without price was a myth. Sarah's expression fell. The cost is life. To activate the Dawn blade's full power to make it capable of severing an ancient bloodline requires a sacrifice. Blood and years. The wielder must pour their own life force into the weapon. For a human, she met his eyes and hers were wet with unshed tears. For a human, it would take decades, maybe all your remaining years. You'd age in moments, Cale. Your life burned up to fuel the weapon. And for a vampire, centuries. I have 800 years behind me. This blade would take, I don't know, half, 2/3. I'd survive. We're hard to kill, but I'd be weakened for decades, maybe a century. Her hand tightened on the dagger's hilt. It's worth it to stop him. To free everyone trapped under his rule, to end his. No. Cale's voice was firm. He crossed to her, placed his hand over hers on the weapon. There has to be another way. There isn't. Sarada's voice broke. Don't you understand? This is my purpose, my redemption. 800 years of sin and finally a chance to do something that matters. To sacrifice myself to stop the monster who created me. That's justice. That's right. No, Cale repeated. That's not justice. That's just more death, more loss. His other hand came up to cup her face. Warm skin against cold. Mortal against immortal. You told me you learned to say no to monsters. Well, I'm saying no to this. I won't watch you burn away your life. I've lived 800 years. Sarah's voice rose. Desperate. I've had lifetimes. You've barely had 30. Don't you dare tell me your years are worth less than mine. I'm not. Cale's thumb brushed away a silver tear that had escaped her eye. I'm telling you they're worth the same. And neither of us should have to die to stop one evil man, vampire, whatever. There has to be a third option. There isn't always a third option. Sarah tried to pull away, but Cale held firm. His human stubbornness matching her supernatural strength. Sometimes the choice is just who dies and what they die for. Sometimes then we find a fourth option. Cale leaned his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling, his warm, hers cool. Mortality and immortality sharing space. In the ancient twilight. We're smart. You've got centuries of tactical experience. I've got a hunter's cunning and absolutely nothing left to lose. Together, We find a way that doesn't end with you as a martyr or me as a withered corpse." Sarah closed her eyes and more. Tears fell. Silver and red mixed blood and something else. Something that might have been the last remnants of hope. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you care so much? You barely know me." 3 days, Cale. We've known each other 3 days, and most of that you've been fighting for your life because of me. Why won't you just let me do the right thing and sacrifice myself?" Because Cale said simply, truthfully, terrifyingly, "I think I'm falling in love with you, and I've already lost one person I loved. I'm not doing it again. Not without a fight." The silence that followed was profound. Somewhere above, in the world beyond the temple, enemies circled, and ancient vampires plotted revenge. But in the sanctum, time seemed to stop, suspended in that breath between confession and response. Sarah opened her eyes and they were fully brown. No red, no black, just deep. Mortal brown, wet with tears. She shouldn't be able to cry. "You're an idiot," she whispered. "I'm a monster. I've killed thousands. I'll outlive you by centuries. Every moment you spend with me is a moment stolen from a normal life, a human life, the kind you deserve." "Don't want normal," Cale interrupted. "Normal died 3 years ago. I want this. You, the danger and the terror, and yes, even the probability that it ends badly. Because the alternative is going back to that cabin alone, going back to being half alive, and I can't. I won't. Not when I finally found someone who understands what it means to be trapped between death and living." Sarah made a sound, half laugh, half sob, and then she was kissing him. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate, fierce. 800 years of loneliness, and 3 years of grief colliding in that ancient sanctum. Her lips were cold but soft, her hand fisted in his shirt, the dawn blade clattering to the floor, forgotten as she pulled him closer, as if she could merge them together through sheer will. Cale responded with equal desperation, his arms around her, holding her like she was the only real thing in a world of ghosts. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she didn't technically need to breathe, but emotions made her body mimic mortal responses. Sarah rested her forehead against his and laughed, really laughed, bright and clear and young, the way she might have laughed 800 years ago, before the world broke her. "All right," she said, her voice still thick with tears but steadier now. "All right, you beautiful fool. Well, find a fourth option together. And if we die trying, at least we die choosing it, not accepting it." Together, Cale agreed. They stood there in the twilight sanctum, holding each other, the dawn blade on the floor between them, while above the world plotted their destruction. But for that moment, they had something stronger than ancient weapons or vampire power. They had each other, and sometimes that's enough to build hope on. They spent hours in the sanctum planning. The temple provided everything they needed. Ancient texts carved into the walls, diagrams showing vampire vulnerabilities, even caches of preserved supplies, dried foods that human allies had left centuries ago, preserved by the same magic that kept the sanctum timeless. Sarah translated the old languages, sharing knowledge that human scholars would kill for, the structure of vampire bloodlines, the politics of the night courts, the weaknesses even ancient vampires couldn't overcome. But as the light filtering through the cracks in the ceiling shifted from silver to gold, afternoon fading toward evening, a tension grew between them. Unspoken but present, heavy as stone. Nightfall was coming, and with it, Sarah's patience would end. "Hell come tonight," Sarah said quietly. She sat cross-legged before one of the murals, tracing symbols with her finger, committing them to memory. "He's given us the day to stew in our fear, to realize how hopeless this is. That's his way. Psychological warfare before physical. Break the spirit and the body follows. Easily. Kale checked his bow for the dozenth time. Strings still tight, arrows still straight. Busy work, but it kept his hands from shaking. Will the temple's protection hold against him? No. Sarah's answer was flat, certain. The temple recognizes me because I once served the Covenant's ideals, even if I didn't know it at the time. But Sir is older, stronger, and his claim on me predates any sanctuary magic. He'll be able to enter. Maybe with effort, maybe with pain, but he'll enter. Then we fight. We fight. Seraph agreed. But not to win. Not yet. We fight to survive. Long enough to make him underestimate us. To think he's won. And then she touched the Dawn blade which she retrieved and attached to her belt. Then we strike. Fast and certain. One chance. Kale. We'll have one chance to change this from an execution to a real fight. And you're sure you can wield it without the sacrifice? Kale asked for the third time, still not quite believing the solution they'd found in those ancient texts. The sacrifice isn't required to use the blade, only to activate its full power to make it capable of severing the oldest bloodlines. Sarah's expression was grim. Against a younger vampire, it would cut through bloodline connections like regular steel through flesh. Against Sir, it'll hurt him, weaken him, but not enough to kill him unless I pour my life into it, which you won't do. Which I won't do, she promised. We agreed. We survive this. Together or not at all. Kale crossed to her, sat beside her, their backs against the cold stone. When this is over, if we survive, what happens then? You can't go back to hiding. Sir won't stop. No, he won't. Sarah leaned into him, her head on his shoulder, a gesture that was becoming familiar, comfortable. But maybe we don't hide. Maybe we do. What I should have done a century ago. We fight. Really fight. Gather allies. Vampires who are tired of the old ways. Humans who understand that not all night walkers are monsters. Build something new from the ashes of the old. A new covenant, Kale said. Softly. A new covenant, Sarah agreed. It sounds impossible. Probably is impossible. But she lifted her head, met his eyes. And in hers he saw something that took his breath away. Hope. Real. Dangerous. Fragile hope. But I've lived 800 years believing impossible things. Maybe it's time I believed in an impossible dream instead of an impossible nightmare. Kale kissed her, then gently this time, not desperate but affirming. Then that's what we'll build. Starting tonight. Starting with surviving. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in an instant. Sarah was on her feet before Kale finished gasping. The dawn blade in her hand, her body between him and the sanctum's entrance. The twilight that had filled the chamber darkened, shadows pooling in corners, spreading like spilled ink. And through those shadows he walked. Sir entered the sanctum like a king entering a throne room, his presence filling the space, making the ancient magic itself recoil. He was even more terrifying here than he'd been in a clearing. His red eyes glowed in the darkness. His silver hair seemed to move independent of wind. And around him the air bent, reality struggling to accommodate his impossible age and power. But it was his expression that made Kale's blood run cold. Not anger, not fury at their defiance. Something worse. Sorrow, genuine ancient sorrow, the kind that comes from watching everything you've ever built crumble despite your best efforts. Sarah, he said, and his voice carried none of the mockery from before. Just weariness, just pain, my Sarah, my star. Look at what you've reduced us to. Enemies in a sacred place preparing to murder each other over a mortal who will be dust in a heartbeat. Is this really what you want? Is this really what 800 years together have come to? We were never together, Sarah replied. her voice steady despite the terror Cale could feel radiating from her through whatever bond they'd formed. You owned me. That's not the same thing. I saved you. For the first time, emotion cracked through. Sriya's control. Rage, yes, but beneath it something more painful. You were dying on that battlefield, gutted by an enemy sword, choking on your own blood. I could have let you die. Should have let you die. But I saw something in you. Fire, fury, will. And I thought, here is someone who could be magnificent if given the chance. So I gave you that chance. I gave you everything. You gave me slavery dressed as purpose. Sarah shot back. You made me a weapon and called it a gift. Because that's what you are. Sir's voice rose, echoing in the sanctum, making dust rain from the ancient ceiling. Do you think I made you cruel? Made you violent? Simply refined what was already there. You were a soldier, Seraph, a killer. Even as a human. I just made you better at it. Gave you centuries to perfect your craft instead of a handful of years. Before age and death stole your edge. And that's where you're wrong. Sarah's voice dropped, became cold as winter midnight. Yes, I was a soldier. Yes, I killed. But I killed for reasons: to protect my village, to defend my people, to stop invaders. You took that capacity for violence and divorced it from purpose, from meaning. You made me kill not because it was necessary but because you commanded it. You took a warrior and made her a monster. Sir flinched. Actually flinched as if the word had cut deeper than any blade. I made you immortal. I made you legendary. Songs will be sung about you for centuries after that mortal dust has blown away. How is that monstrous? Because I don't want to be a legend. Sarah screamed, and the raw pain in her voice made Cale's chest ache. Wanted to be a person, someone who could love without having it turned to ash. Someone who could build instead of just destroying. Someone who could wake up and not hate what she saw in the mirror. You took that from me, sir, you took me from me. And you've spent 8 centuries acting like it was a favor. Silence crashed down like a physical thing. Sir stood, frozen, his perfect features twisted with emotions. Cale couldn't read. Rage, sorrow, something that might have been regret or might have been incomprehension. And for the first time since entering the sanctum, he looked at Cale. Really. Looked, his ancient red eyes meeting mortal brown. You, sir, dangerously. You're the catalyst, the match that lit this fire. 3 days ago she was resigned to her fate, running but accepting the inevitable. Then you showed her mercy, and now she thinks she can have redemption. He began to walk forward, shadows flowing with him, and Sarah shifted to maintain her defensive position. Do you know what mercy is, little mortal? It's the luxury of the naive, the fantasy of those who've never faced real consequences. In the real world, in the old world, there is only power and those who wield it. That's where you're wrong, Cale said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. He stepped up beside Seraph, his grandfather's useless sword drawn, his bow in his offhand. Mercy isn't weakness. It's the hardest form of strength, the choice to not inflict harm when you have every ability and right to do so. And Sarah showed that strength when she refused to slaughter Grey Home. She's stronger than you'll ever be because she can do the one thing you can't. And what's that? Change. Sitha's expression went utterly cold. I see. You've made her believe in fairy tales, in redemption arcs and happily ever afters. How charmingly human. His form began to shift, shadows solidifying around him like armor, his fingers extending into claws. Very well. I'll show you both what happens to children who believe in fairy tales when the monster comes calling. He moved, not walked, not ran. He simply was therein. Front of Seraph, his clawed hand driving toward her chest fast enough to leave after images. She barely got the Dawn blade up in time. The blade caught his wrist, and where it touched his flesh, his skin sizzled, actual smoke rising. From the contact, Sir hissed in pain and leaped back, moving with grace that defied his size. So he said, examining the burn mark on his wrist, his voice carrying surprised respect. You found one of the Covenant blades. Clever. That will make this more interesting. And then the real fight began. Cale had thought the battle with the Bloodbound had been chaos. This was something else entirely. Sarah and Sir moved at speeds that his eyes could barely track. Blurs of motion, the Dawn blade flashing silver. Gold, Sir's claws leaving trails of shadow in the air. They fought across the sanctum, using the pillars as cover, the ceiling as launching points, moving in 3 dimensions, while Cale could only stumble along behind. He tried to help. Arrows loosed at Syrah's back. The ancient vampire batted them aside without looking, or caught them mid-flight and threw them back with enough force to embed in stone. His sword flashing out when Sir got too close, missing by miles, the vampire lord too fast, too experienced. But he was outmatched. Completely, utterly outmatched. This was a battle between immortals, between beings who'd honed combat skills over centuries. His mortality, his fragility was a liability. Every time Sarah had to dodge to protect him, Sir landed a blow. Every time she had to adjust her position to keep him out of the fight, she lost ground. And Sir knew. It was using it. You see, the ancient vampire called, his voice not even winded as he drove Sarah back with a flurry of strikes. This is why warbirds don't take consorts. You're torn between fighting and protecting, offense and defense. You're weakened by your attachment to that fragile thing. He feinted left, then struck right, his claws rat across Sarada's ribs, opening deep wounds that wept silver blood. She gasped, fell back, and suppressed the advantage, his attacks becoming more savage, more precise. They were losing. Even with the Dawn blade, even with the Sanctum's protection, they were losing. Sir was too strong, too fast, too experienced. And the ancient vampire's hand closed around Sarada's throat, lifting her off the ground, slamming her against a pillar hard enough to crack the stone. The Dawn blade fell from her grip, clattering across the floor. And Sitha's other hand drew back, claws extended, aimed at her heart. It ends, he said quietly. Finally, mercifully, it ends. I'll make it quick, my star. And then I'll kill your mortals slowly enough that you feel it even in death. This is my final gift to you. The peace you've been seeking for a century. No. Cale didn't think. Couldn't think. He just moved, throwing himself across the sanctum, diving for the Dawn blade. His hand closed around the hilt, and the weapon sang a crystalline note that resonated in his bones, in his soul. The blade recognizing intent, recognizing will, recognizing a mortal willing to sacrifice everything. He came up in a roll and drove the blade into Sir's back. The ancient vampire screamed. It wasn't a human scream. It was the sound of reality tearing, of something fundamental being undone. Sir released Sarah, spinning his hand closing around Cale's throat, lifting him as easily as a child lifts a doll. His red eyes blazed with fury and agony. You dare. But the blade was still in his back, and its power was working. Cale could see it. Black veins spreading from the wound like inverse lightning crawling across Shriya's skin. The ancient vampire's form was flickering, his shadow armor dissipating, his eyes losing their glow. The blade, Sarah gasped from where she'd collapsed. It severing his bloodline connection. But not fast enough. It needs, she met Cale's eyes, and horror bloomed in her expression. No, Cale, and oh, don't you dare. But Cale understood. The Dawn Blade needed life force to complete its work to fully sever and bloodline as ancient as Syrah's. And right now, Cale was holding it. Right now, his life force was already feeding into the weapon, drawn by his contact with it, his willingness to sacrifice. He could feel it, his years, his remaining decades being pulled into the blade, fueling its power. His hair was already showing streaks of gray. His hands were beginning to wrinkle, age spots appearing like dark flowers blooming on his skin. Sir felt it too. His grip on Cale's throat loosened slightly. Not from mercy, but from weakness. What have you? Mercy. Cale gasped through the crushing grip, through the feeling of his life being burned away like candle wax. This is mercy. We're letting you live. We're just taking away your ability to hurt anyone ever again. No. Sir's voice was small now, almost childlike with panic. No, I am ancient. I am eternal. You cannot. But they could. The blade finished its work and Sir's scream cut off mid-cry. The shadows around him dissipated like smoke in wind. His red eyes faded to ordinary brown. His skin, which had held the power of undeath, flushed with something almost alive, and he fell, dropping Cale, collapsing to the sanctum floor like a puppet with cut strings. Cale lay where he'd fallen, gasping, staring at his hands. They were old, not ancient, but aged. 40 years, maybe 50 years worth of life drained away in seconds. His vision was blurrier. His joints ached. His hair, he knew without checking, had gone iron gray. But he was alive. Sarah was there instantly, cradling him. Her face a mask of rage and anguish and terror. You fool. You beautiful, idiotic, selfless fool. You just gave up. Decades. You. She was sobbing now, blood tears streaming down her face, her hands pattering over him as if she could push the years back into his body through sheer will. I told you. I told you he'd find another way. I told you. Had to. Cale managed, his voice rough, older. He was going to kill you. Couldn't let that happen. So you killed yourself. Instead, slowly. You've just cut your lifespan by. She couldn't finish, just held him tighter, her cold body shaking with sobs. Across the sanctum, Sir stirred. He rose, slowly, unsteadily, moving like someone who'd forgotten how bodies worked. He looked at his hands, ordinary hands now, not clawed, not powerful, and something in his expression broke. What have you done? He whispered. What have you done? I was ancient. I was power. And now he looked up at them, and his ordinary brown eyes were filled with something Cale had never expected to see. Their fear. Pure mortal fear. I'm weak. I can feel it. The connection is gone. The bloodline is gone. I'm cut off. Isolated. I'm alone. Sarah finished. Coldly, still holding Cale. You're alone, Sir, truly alone. Maybe for the first time in your existence. No bloodline power. No ancient magic. Just you and the centuries of sins you've accumulated. How does it feel? Sir stared at her. Then at Cale. Then at his own trembling hands. And then he did something neither of them expected. He ran. Not with supernatural speed. He couldn't anymore. But with ordinary, desperate human terror. He fled from the sanctum. His footsteps echoing, fading, disappearing. Into the ruins above. They were left alone in the twilight. Cale aging and exhausted in Sarada's arms. The dawn. Blade smoking where it lay on the stone floor. You should have let me do it, Sarah whispered, rocking him gently. Should have let me pay the price. No, Cale said, managing a weak smile. Despite everything. We are partners. We share costs. That was the deal. You're infuriating. You're terrifying. I love you. I love you too. And in the ancient sanctum, surrounded by weapons, forged to fight gods and monsters, they held each other while Cale's stolen years settled into his bones. And Sarah's tears mixed silver and red on his aged face. Outside, Sir fled into a world that would no longer bow to him. And somewhere far away, in courts of shadow and blood, word began to spread. The Ancient One had fallen. The Warbride had won. The night would never be the same. Death had a taste. Cale had always wondered in the abstract way that mortals wonder about the inevitable, what dying would feel like. Would it be sudden like a door slamming shut, or gradual like falling asleep? He'd watched his wife die, watched the light leave her eyes piece by piece, but he'd never known what it felt like from the inside. Now he knew. It felt like being unmade, like having the threads that held him together slowly unraveled one by one, his body trying to catch up with the years the Dawnblade had stolen. His heart struggled to find its rhythm, beating too fast then too slow, confused by suddenly having to pump blood through vessels that had aged 40 years in as many seconds. His lungs burned with every breath. His joints screamed protest at movements that should have been simple. He was dying. Not immediately. The Dawnblade had taken his years, not his life, but the shock of it was killing him anyway. His body couldn't adapt fast enough to the sudden change, and Sarah knew it. No, she whispered, cradling him against her chest, her hands frantically checking his pulse, his breathing, her centuries of experience telling her what Cale already felt. No, no, no. You don't get to die. Not after everything. Cale, stay with me. Trying, he managed, but his vision was graying at the edges. Darkness creeping in. Not sure I can. Sarah's expression shifted through emotions faster than Cale could track. Grief, rage, determination, and finally terrified hope. There's a way. There's always a way. But you have to, she stopped, her voice catching. You have to give permission. You have to choose it, or it won't work. Or it'll work wrong. And you'll become something neither of us wants. What? Cale's voice was barely a whisper now. What way? Blood bond. Not the shallow one we already have. That's barely a connection. A tether. I mean, true bond, deep magic, old magic. I feed you my blood, my essence, and it changes you. Not into a vampire. You'd have to die and be reborn for that, but into something between all touched, the old texts call it. You'd heal from this, from the aging, from the shock. You'd be stronger, faster, live longer. But you'd be bound to me. Part of you would always be mine. And part of me would always be yours. Our souls would, she was crying again, blood tears falling on his face. Our souls would be tangled together forever, until one of us dies. Cale's mind, even fading, caught on the keywords. Would I still be me? Yes. Sarada's answer was immediate, fierce. I swear it. This isn't slavery, isn't it? It's partnership. You'd keep your will, your thoughts, yourself, but you'd feel me, my emotions, my presence, and I'd feel you. We'd be connected. Always downsides. He managed a weak smile despite the darkness closing in. There's always downsides. You'd need blood occasionally, not to drain people, just a little. Mine would work best. You'd be sensitive to silver, to certain wards. Sunlight wouldn't hurt you, but you'd be stronger at night. And you'd live, her voice broke. You'd live for centuries. Not immortal, but close. You're human. Lifespan would stretch. Years becoming decades. Decades becoming centuries. Everyone you know would die while you barely aged. Sounds familiar. Cale whispered. Sounds like what you've lived. Yes. Sarada's voice was barely audible. I'd be condemning you to my curse. Loneliness watching the world change. Outliving everyone except she met his fading eyes. Except me. We'd have each other for as long as we both survived. Cale should have been horrified. Should have refused. Everything about this screamed. Wrongness, violation of natural law, the kind of dark magic that old priests railed against in their sermons. He'd be giving up his humanity, his mortality, the natural order of life and death. But, as the darkness crept closer, as he felt his heartbeat stumble and nearly stop, he thought about what mortality had given him in the past 3 years. A cabin full of loneliness. Endless aching isolation, grief that didn't heal because there was nothing to distract from it, no one to share it with, just empty days bleeding into empty nights. And he thought about the past 3 days with Sarah, fighting beside her, learning her story, seeing her not as a monster but as a person crushed beneath the weight of immortality and trying desperately to be better, falling in love with her fierce determination, her wounded hope, her terrible, beautiful refusal to give up on redemption. 3 days of feeling alive. Yes, he whispered. Do it. I choose this. Choose you. Relief crashed across Sarada's features, followed immediately by determination. This will hurt, she warned. The bond forming. It's not gentle. Nothing about us has been gentle, Cale managed. A weak smile. Why start now? Sarah would have laughed if she weren't sobbing. Instead, she bit into her own wrist, her fangs extending for the first time Cale had seen, sharp and terrible and somehow still beautiful, and blood welled up, silver bright in the twilight. Sanctum. Drink, she commanded softly, pressing her wrist to his lips. The taste was indescribable, not metallic like human blood, but something else. Cold and electric and ancient, like drinking liquid starlight, like swallowing centuries. It burned down his throat, spreading through his chest, his limbs, his entire body with electric intensity. He gasped against her wrist, but she held firm, whispering words in that old language, the one from before kingdoms, the one that belonged to first peoples and elder magics. Then she pulled her wrist away, and before Cale could ask what came next, her fangs were at his throat. The bite should have hurt, should have been agony, violation, predator claiming prey. Instead, it was almost tender. Her lips soft against his skin, her fangs piercing cleanly, the draw of blood gentle rather than savage. She wasn't feeding. She was sharing, taking a part of him in as she'd given a part of herself, completing the circuit. And then the bond formed. Cale screamed. Couldn't help it. The sensation was overwhelming, like being torn apart and rebuilt simultaneously, like every nerve ending firing at once. Pleasure and pain, and emotions that weren't his flooding through him. He felt Sarah's centuries of loneliness crash into his soul like a tidal wave. Felt her guilt, her grief, her desperate hope that maybe this time, this person wouldn't be taken from her by time or violence. And she felt him. His 3 years of suffocating grief, his survivor's guilt, his bone-deep loneliness that matched her own. His love for his dead wife mixing with his growing love for Sarah, not replacing but existing alongside, complicated and messy and human. Their souls collided, tangled, merged, not completely, but enough that boundaries blurred, that where one ended and the other began became a question without clear answer. When it ended, seconds or hours later, time had lost meaning. Cale lay gasping in Sarada's arms. But the darkness was gone. The pain was gone. His heartbeat, strong and steady, his breathing clear, his vision sharp. And beneath his skin, he could feel power. Not his own, but borrowed, shared, a gift from the ancient vampire who held him. He looked at his hands, still aged from the Dawnblade's price, still showing the 40 years he'd sacrificed, but the wrinkles were fading slightly, the age spots lightening. The bond was healing him slowly, pushing back the worst of the damage. He'd never returned to his original age, but he wouldn't die from the shock now. "How do you feel?" Sarah whispered, and Cale could feel her anxiety through the bond. Her terror that she'd damaged him changed him into something he'd hate. "Different," Cale said honestly. "Stronger, like I could run for miles without tiring. Like I could see in the dark." Like he paused, feeling the connection between them. The way he could sense her presence like a second heartbeat. The way her emotions colored the edges of his own. Like I'm not alone anymore. Like I'll never be alone again, even if you're miles away. Is that Sarah's voice was small, vulnerable? Is that good or terrifying? Cale sat up, the movement easy now. Strength flooding his limbs, and cooped her face in his hands, his weathered, aged hands against her eternal youth. "Both," he admitted. "It's both, and I don't care. Because the alternative was dying without you, and I'm selfish enough to prefer this." "You gave up decades for me," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "Sacrificed your natural lifespan to save me from Sir. That's not selfish. That's love." Cale interrupted. "That's love. The stupid, reckless, illogical kind that makes people do impossible things." He leaned forward, rested his forehead against hers, and, "You just bound yourself to me for centuries. Gave me a piece of your immortality, your power, knowing I'll be a weakness enemies can exploit. That's love too." "We're both fools," Sarah whispered. "The best kind of fools," Cale agreed. And then they were kissing. Again, but different this time. Not desperate or frantic, but deep, tasting each other's essence literally and metaphorically. The bond singing between them, amplifying every touch, every sensation. Cale could feel Sarah's desire mixing with his own. Could feel her 800 years of touch starvation. How careful she had to be with mortal lovers who broke so easily. How long it had been since she'd allowed herself this kind of intimacy. And she could feel his grief transforming. The love for his dead wife. Finding a place to rest rather than fester. Making room for new love without erasing the old. Could feel his acceptance of what he'd become, not as a curse, but as a choice, terrifying and wonderful and wholly his own. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Cale from necessity, Sarah from emotion, the sanctum seemed brighter. Somehow, the twilight had become dawn-like, golden light filtering through cracks in the ancient stone, touching the weapons in their loves, making the covenant symbol shimmer. "We should leave," Sarah said reluctantly. "The sanctum has been generous with its protection, but we've spilled blood here, vampire and human both. The old magics will need time to process that. We need to return to the surface." "And do what?" Cale asked, standing with ease that surprised him. The bond had given him vampire strength. Not Sarah's level, but far beyond human norms. Sir is broken, but his followers won't just disperse. The bloodbound, the other vampires who served him, they'll come looking. Let them. Sarah's voice carried a cold edge. The Warbride strategist emerging. Sir fled in weakness. In vampire culture. That's the ultimate sin, showing cowardice, showing vulnerability. His authority is shattered. When word spreads that a mortal and an exiled Warbride defeated him, took his power, a fierce smile crossed her features. Some will come for revenge. But others will come seeking a new banner to follow. Change, Cale. Real change, the kind that takes centuries to build. It starts with one victory. And a blood bond between human and vampire, Kale added, "That's not common, I'm guessing. It's forbidden in most vampire courts." Sarah corrected, "Thralls are slaves, property, not partners. What we've done, a bond of equals of choice. It's heresy to the old ways." Her smile turned sharp, "Which makes it perfect. Let them come. Let them see that humans and vampires can be more than master and slave. Let them see that the old order is crumbling." Kale moved to the Dawn blade, where it still lay on the floor, smoking slightly, its metal showing no blood despite what it had done. He picked it up carefully. It felt warm in his hand, responsive as if it recognized him. "We're keeping this." "Absolutely," Sarah agreed. "It's leverage. Proof that the old weapons still exist, still work." And she paused, her expression conflicted. "And because Sir isn't the only ancient vampire who needs to be brought down, there are others equally cruel, equally entrenched in the old ways. This fight isn't over. It's just beginning." "Good." Kale sheathed the Dawn blade in his belt, then picked up his bow, his grandfather's sword. "I'm tired of hiding. Tired of half-living. If we're doing this, building a new covenant, changing the world, let's do it right." Sarah crossed to him, took his hand, cold and warm intertwined. "It won't be easy. It might take decades, centuries. We'll make enemies on both sides, human and vampire. We'll probably die trying." "Probably," Kale agreed cheerfully. "But we'll die choosing it. Fighting for something that matters. Together, together," Seraph echoed. They walked hand in hand out of the sanctum, up the ancient stairs, into the ruins proper. And as they emerged into the forest, the blood pine thicket that had witnessed so much violence and now witnessed something new, something fragile and hopeful. The last light of dawn was breaking through the trees. Sarah couldn't step into direct sunlight, but through the bond she felt it. Felt the warmth on Kale's skin, the brightness in his eyes, the joy of dawn after a long night. And for the first time in 800 years she experienced sunrise. Not death, not ending, beginning. They stayed in the forest for 3 days. Not hiding, planning, preparing, learning what the bond meant in practical terms, how far it reached, what strengths and weaknesses it created, and gathering resources from the ruins that the first Covenant defenders had left behind. Kale discovered his new abilities slowly, testing limits with Sarada's guidance. He could see in near total darkness now, the world rendered in silver and shadow. His strength had quadrupled. Not vampire level, but enough that when he drew his bow the strings sang with tension that would have been impossible before. His speed had increased proportionally. He could keep up with Sarah when she moved. At half pace, could dodge strikes that would have skewered him days ago. But it was the mental link that proved most valuable. They could feel each other's presence within about a mile. A constant awareness that the other existed, was safe, was there. Emotions bled through when they were close. Happiness, fear, pain, desire, creating an intimacy that went beyond physical touch. And if they concentrated, they could send impressions, feelings, even fragmented thoughts across the bond. "This is what Thralls feel," Sarah explained as they tested the connection, sitting together in the sanctum on the second night. "Except for them, it's one way. The vampire feels the Thront controls them. Through the bond. The THR feels only compulsion, the crushing weight of their master's will. This is different," Kale sent back, still marveling at the sensation of thought without words. "I feel you, but you're not controlling me. It's like having a conversation partner always available, always listening. That's because I forged it as partnership." Sarah's mental voice carried pride and pain. "Most vampires don't know how or don't care to learn. It's easier to dominate than to share." On the third day, they ventured into the deep ruins, the catacombs beneath even the sanctum, where the first covenant's oldest secrets lay buried. Sarah had known they existed, but had never dared explore them alone. Now, with Cale beside her, the bond connecting them, she felt brave enough to face what lay below. The descent was treacherous, stairs crumbling with age, darkness so complete even Cale's enhanced vision struggled. But Sarah moved with confidence, one hand trailing along walls carved with history, the other gripping Cale's hand, pulling him deeper into the earth. The first covenant wasn't just a treaty, she explained as they descended, her voice echoing in the narrow passage. It was a transformation. Humans and vampires had been killing each other for generations before the old dark rose. When that happened, when something worse than their hatred threatened to consume everything, they had to choose. Die proud and separate or survive humble and together. They chose survival. Cale said, they chose unity. Sarah corrected, that's different. Survival is just not dying. Unity is building something together, something neither side could create alone. The weapons we found in the sanctum, those were forged by human smiths and vampire mages working in concert, combining mortal craftsmanship with immortal power. The result was stronger than either could manage alone. They reached the bottom of the stairs, emerging into a vast chamber that made the sanctum above seem small. The ceiling soared away into darkness, supported by columns carved to resemble trees, but not any trees Cale recognized. These were alien, wrong, beautiful, and terrible, with branches that seemed to move in absent wind and roots that dug into the floor like seeking fingers. And everywhere were remnants of the war they'd fought. Weapons lay scattered across the floor. Swords shattered, shields cracked, bows broken, armor still bearing the marks of whatever the old dark soldiers had wielded. And between them, skeletons, human and vampire both fallen together, their bones intermingled, their final position suggesting they died defending each other. This was the last stand, Sarah whispered, reverence heavy in her voice. When the old dark broke through all other defenses, this is where the first covenant made their final defense. And somehow, impossibly, they won, sealed the enemy away, paid the price in blood and sacrifice, and saved the world. She knelt beside a skeleton, human based on the size, wearing shattered armor that still bore the covenant symbol. And then their descendants forgot what they'd fought, forgot what they'd sacrificed, and started killing each other again. Cale knelt beside her, looking at the ancient dead. Why? Why forget something so important? Because remembering is painful, Sarah said quietly. Because the old dark's existence meant neither humans nor vampires were the apex predators, the masters of creation. It meant there were things older, things that made our conflict seem like children squabbling. And neither side wanted to face that. So they rewrote history, turned apocalypse into myth, and went back to hating each other because hatred is easier than fear. She stood, moving deeper into the chamber, and Cale followed, stepping carefully around the ancient dead. At the far end, raised on a dais, sat something that made his blood run cold, even through the bond's comfort. An altar, black stone veined with silver, carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. And on it, sealed in crystal that pulsed with its own light, was a book. Not a book exactly, it was too organic for that, its pages looking more like preserved skin, its binding living with still bearing leaves despite millennia underground. As they approached, Cale could hear it whispering, not in any language he knew, but in harmonics that resonated with the bond, with the blood Sarah had given him, with something fundamental in his altered nature. The Covenant Codex. Sarah breathed, stopping at the base of the dais, staring at the book with something close to worship. I thought it Was legend, a myth to inspire the fighters? But it's real. What is it? Cale asked, though part of him, the part connected to Sarah through blood and magic, already knew the collected knowledge of the First Covenant. Every spell they created, every weapon they forged, every strategy they used. Against the old dark. But more than that, Sarada's voice dropped to a whisper. It contains the truth. What the old dark was, where it came from, why it attacked, and most importantly, she met. Cale's eyes, how to make sure it stays sealed, because none of the original Covenant members believed their solution was permanent. They knew someday it would try to break free again. Cale stared at the book, at the way it pulsed with inner light, and felt dread settle into his bones. And if it breaks free, if the old dark returns, then humans and vampires will have to unite again or die separately. Sarah began climbing the DEA steps, her movement slow, respectful, as if approaching a shrine. This book is proof that cooperation is possible, more than possible, necessary. If we can bring this to the surface, show it to both human and vampire leaders. Show them what their ancestors achieved together, we might be able to build a new covenant. Cale finished. Not just you and me, but entire societies. A real peace. Not just absence of war. Exactly. Sarah reached the altar, her hand hovering over the crystal. But it won't be easy. The old powers, vampire lords like Sir, human rulers who benefit from conflict. They'll fight this. They'll call us heretics, traitors, threats to the natural order. We'll be hunted by both sides. So nothing changes from the past 3 days, Cale said with dark humor, joining her on the Ds. We're already hunted. Might as well be hunted for something worthwhile. Seraph laughed bright and clear, the sound echoing in the ancient chamber like bells. You're either the bravest man I've met or the most foolish. The blood pine thicket was silent around them, waiting, watching. And in the distance, Cale heard sounds that made his enhanced senses perk up. Not threats, at least not immediate ones. Footsteps. Voices, multiple people moving through the forest, heading toward the ruins. Sarah heard them too, her body tensing, hand moving instinctively toward the dawn blade at her belt. But then she paused, tilting her head, listening to harmonics. Cale couldn't quite catch. Vampires, she said slowly, but not bloodbound. These are different, and her eyes widened. And humans together, moving in formation, not fighting. Through the trees, figures began to emerge. 7 vampires, their eyes reflecting in the twilight, moving with predatory grace. And beside them, 9 humans, armed but not hostile, carrying weapons but not wielding them. Together they approached the ruins, approached Sarah and Cale with expressions of curiosity and desperate hope. An older vampire, not ancient like Sir, but centuries old based on his bearing, stepped forward. He bowed deeply, respectfully to Sarah. Sarah, the Scarlet Warbride of legend, breaker of chains. His voice carried an accent Cale couldn't place from some region that probably didn't exist anymore. We heard what you did. How you defeated Sir. Severed his power. Sent him fleeing like a coward. Word is spreading through the shadow courts. The Ancient One has fallen. A human woman stepped forward beside him, weathered, scarred, carrying a sword that had seen real use. And we heard about Grey Home. About how you refused to slaughter us. How you chose mercy over obedience. She glanced at Cale, at the bond that those with supernatural senses could probably feel, and her expression held wonder. And how you've taken a human consort as equal, not thr. Defied every law the old courts enforce. We've come seeking. The vampire continued. Seeking to join you if you'll have us to follow a banner that stands for something other than endless war and domination. To help build He trailed off uncertain. A new covenant, Sarah finished softly. She looked at Cale, at the Code DX in her arms, at these desperate souls, vampire and human both, who'd come looking for hope. Yes. Yes. We're building a new covenant, a world where humans and vampires can cooperate, can live without constant fear and hatred. And we could use help. The vampire and human exchanged glances, relief, joy, determination. And one by one, the others stepped forward, vampire and human alternating, until they formed a circle around Sarah and Cale. Then we're yours, the vampire said. To plan with, to fight beside, to die for if necessary. The old order is crumbling. Let's make sure something better rises from its ashes. Seraph looked at them, at these volunteers, these believers in an impossible dream. And through the bond, Cale felt her 800 years of despair beginning to crack, light seeping through the fissures. They weren't alone anymore. The revolution had begun. Word spread like wildfire through both worlds, human and vampire, carried by messengers who believed and skeptics who didn't. The story grew with each telling, embellished but rooted in truth. A fallen war bride and her human consort had defeated an ancient vampire lord, claimed the first covenant's lost knowledge, and were gathering followers to build a new order. Some called them saviors, others called them heretics, but no one could ignore them. Within a week, their numbers had grown to 40. 20 vampires who'd fled the old courts, 20 humans who survived vampire attacks and refused to let hatred consume them. They established a base camp in the ruins using the sanctum as a headquarters. The covenant magic protecting them from both supernatural and mundane threats. Cale discovered he had a talent for logistics. His years of solitary hunting had taught him resource management, survival skills, how to make little stretch far. He organized supply runs, coordinated watches, mediated disputes between humans still uncomfortable around vampires and vampires who'd never seen humans as equals. And slowly, carefully, they became something more than a group of refugees. They became a community. Sarah was different, too. The Warbride persona, cold, efficient, deadly, gradually gave way to something warmer. She smiled more, laughed occasionally, let her guard down around people who weren't Cale. The bond helped through it. Cale could feel when her centuries of conditioning threatened to reassert itself, when the urge to command rather than cooperate surged up, and he'd send calm reassurance through their connection, anchoring her to her chosen identity. But it wasn't all peace and cooperation. On the 8th day, a messenger arrived. Human, barely more than a boy riding a horse half dead from exhaustion. He carried news that made Sarah's expression go cold and terrible. Sirs, old territory, his network of thralls and bloodbound and loyal vampires hadn't dissolved with his fall. Instead, his lieutenants had rallied, formed a coalition, and were hunting Sarah and her followers with systematic brutality. They've razed 2 human villages suspected of sending volunteers. The boy gasped, exhausted and terrified. Killed everyone. Left the bodies displayed as warnings. And they're coming here. 3 clans united. Maybe 200 fighters, vampires, bloodbound, even human. Mercenaries who've been paid in. He couldn't finish. Just shook his head. When Sarada's voice was pure war bride. Now cold, calculating, absolute. Tomorrow night, maybe the night after there. Gathering strength, waiting for the new moon when they'll be strongest. 2 days. They had 2 days to prepare for an assault by a force 5 times their size, led by vampires with centuries of combat experience. Determined to crush this rebellion before it could truly begin, the camp erupted into controlled chaos. Fortifications built, weapons distributed, plans made and discarded and remade. The 20 vampires among them were trained fighters, but the humans were mostly survivors, not soldiers. Cale did what he could, teaching them basic archery, basic tactics, but he knew they all knew this was going to be a slaughter unless they changed the game. That night, Sarah called a council. In the sanctum, the vampire and human leaders, plus Cale, gathered around a table they'd built from ruins timber. The Covenant Codex lay open before them, its pages rippling despite the still air, responding to the assembled group's mixed natures. "We can't win a conventional fight," Sarah said bluntly. "They outnumber us 5-1, and most of their fighters have decades or centuries more experience." "Still going with both," Cale replied. Sarah reached down and touched the crystal. It sang a note of pure power, and the crystal began to crack, fracturing along invisible lines. The book inside pulsed brighter as if recognizing her touch, her intent, the bond she carried with a human partner. "The Codex can only be opened by those who embody its principles," Sarah explained. Her voice strained as power flowed between her and the crystal. Partnership between human and vampire. Genuine cooperation, not domination. The original Covenant members built in a safeguard. Only those who truly believed in unity could access this knowledge. The crystal shattered, fragments dissolving into light that swirled around them like snow. And the book lay bare, its cover breathing slightly, leaves rustling despite the underground stillness. Sarah lifted it carefully, reverently, and the moment her fingers touched its surface, her eyes went wide. Cale felt it through the bond, a flood of information, of knowledge, of memory. 800 years of her life suddenly contextualized, suddenly understood in light of what the book revealed. "They're not sealed," she whispered, horror thick in her voice. "The old dark, they're not completely sealed. They're sleeping, and the seal is weakening. Has been weakening for centuries." That's why she looked at Cale, her eyes wild with realization. That's why the blood tide wars happened. That's why vampire and human conflicts have intensified. The old dark can't break through yet, but they can influence, can whisper in dreams, can feed hatred and division. They've been orchestrating our mutual destruction, weakening us, so when they finally break free, there's no unified force to oppose them. Cale felt his blood run cold. How long? How long until they break free? Sarah flipped through pages that weren't quite pages, her eyes scanning text that shifted between languages. The Codex doesn't give exact time frames. The old dark exist partially outside time, but based on the seals. Degradation patterns. She looked up and her expression was grave. Decades. Maybe a century at most, possibly sooner if vampire-human conflicts continue to escalate. "Then we have work to do," Cale said, his voice steadier than he felt. "We need to get this to people who listen. Build alliances. Prepare. They'll call us mad." Sarah warned. "Ancient evils sealed beneath the earth. It sounds like fever dreams and campfire tales. Then we make them believe." Cale replied. "Starting with the vampires who defied Sir, the humans who survived vampire attacks but don't want eternal war. We build slowly, carefully, one person at a time." Sarah closed the Codex, holding it against her chest like a child holding a precious treasure. Through the bond, Cale felt her wearing emotions, hope and terror, determination and exhaustion, the weight of 800 years of guilt meeting the fragile possibility of redemption. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted quietly. "I'm a weapon Cale was made to destroy, not to build. What if I fail? What if I make everything worse?" Cale took her hand, cold and warm intertwined, and sensed certainty through the bond, absolute and unshakable. "You won't be alone. That's the point of this." He gestured at the bond between them, at the Codex in her arms, at the ancient chamber around them where humans and vampires had died together defending the world. "You don't have to be the weapon anymore. You can be the architect and I'll be right beside you every step. Sarah looked at him, at this human who'd aged decades for her, who'd bound his soul to hers, who faced the end of the world with determination instead of despair. And slowly, carefully, she smiled. Not her warrior's smile, sharp and cold, but something genuine, something that might be the beginning of joy. Then let's start, she said. Let's build something impossible. They descended from the D's carrying the Code DX, leaving the ancient dead to their eternal rest. As they climbed back up through the catacombs, through the sanctum toward the surface and the world beyond, Cale felt something settle in his chest. Not peace exactly, but purpose, direction, a reason to live that went beyond simple survival. They emerged into the forest. At twilight, Sarada's time, when the world balanced between day and night, light and shadow. If we try to hold the ruins, we'll be overwhelmed in hours. So we run. One of the human leaders, a former soldier named Marcus, said grimly. Scatter, regroup somewhere else, build strength before facing them. They'll hunt us down. A vampire named Lyra countered. Her eyes were ancient, sad, wise. Sitha's lieutenants know how we think, how we move. We'd be picked off. In pieces. No, if we run, we die slowly. If we fight, we at least die with purpose. Or, Cale said quietly, drawing everyone's attention. We use what they don't expect. We use the Code DX. Silence fell. Sarah looked at him through the bond, questioning, and he sent impressions, ideas he'd been forming while helping organize defenses, strategies drawn from hunters' cunning rather than warriors' pride. The Code DX contains First Covenant magic, Cale continued, standing, placing his hand on the living book. Spells designed for humans and vampires working together, amplifying each other's strengths. We have both here. We have partnership. What if we use the old magic the way it was intended, not as individuals fighting side by side, but as a unified force? The rituals require preparation, Liara said slowly, her ancient eyes studying the Code DX with new interest. Days of study, proper materials, skilled casters. We have 2 days, Cale interrupted. We have a book that wants to be used. I can feel it through the bond. The way it's eager to share its knowledge with people who embody the Covenant. And we have something the original defenders didn't have. He looked at Sarah, at the bond shimmering between them, visible to those with supernatural senses. We have a vampire and human who are literally soul bonded. We can anchor the ritual, channel the magic through our connection. Understanding dawned across the assembled faces, hope mixing with terror, because this could work, or it could kill everyone involved. Spectacularly. Sarah leaned forward, studying the Code DX, flipping through pages with increasing speed. Here, she said, finally, tapping a section that showed diagrams of humans and vampires in specific formations, symbols connecting them. The unity, right? It temporarily bonds human and vampire pairs, creating links similar to what Ko and I share, but temporary, lasting only hours. During that time, the pairs share strength, healing, perception. A human gains vampire power. A vampire gains human adaptability, creativity, resistance to some of our traditional weaknesses. And together, Marcus asked, together, they become something neither side alone can match. Sarah finished. Fast as vampires, but able to operate in sunlight conditions. Strong as vampires, but with human, strategic thinking. It's designed to create a fighting force that can adapt to any enemy, any condition. What's the cost? Another human asked. A woman named who'd lost her family to vampire attacks and joined anyway, determined to break the cycle. Sarada's expression sobered. Trust. complete absolute trust. The pairs have to willingly merge their souls temporarily. If there's doubt, resistance, hidden hatred, the ritual fails. Or worse, it succeeds but creates something twisted. Pairs that tear themselves apart from internal conflict. She looked around the table at vampires and humans who still, despite their best efforts, carried centuries of mutual hatred in their bones. We'd be betting everything on the belief that we've truly moved past that hatred, that we genuinely see each other as equals, as partners. The silence stretched. Outside, the forest sounds continued, normal, peaceful, ignorant of the war that was coming. Then Marcus stood. "I'll do it. Lost my squad to vampire bloodbound 3 years ago. Swear I'd avenge them by killing as many night walkers as possible. But I've spent a week here. Watched you." He nodded at the vampires. "Struggle to see us as people instead of prey. Watched you choose to be better than what you were made to be. If I can trust that can fight bonded to a vampire against our common enemies, then maybe we really can build something new." Slowly others stood. Not all. Some humans and vampires remained seated, their hatred or fear too deep to overcome in mere days. But enough. 10. Human-vampire pairs willing to attempt the unity rite. Willing to stake their lives and souls on the belief that partnership was possible. Sarah looked at Cale, and through the bond he felt her wearing emotions, pride in their followers' courage, terror at what she was about to attempt, determination to see this through. "Are you sure?" she sent. Through their connection. "If the ritual fails, if I make a mistake, these people die. Their blood will be on my hands. More blood added to centuries of stains. Then don't make a mistake." Cale sent back firm, certain his confidence in her. "Absolute. You were a warbride for 700 years. You know strategy, magic, combat, rituals. Use that knowledge for creation instead of destruction. You can do this." Sarah closed her eyes, took a breath she didn't need, and when she opened them again, she was every inch the legendary commander. "Then we begin. Tonight we study the ritual. Tomorrow we prepare the circle, gather the materials. Tomorrow night, when the moon sets, we perform the unity rite. And when Sir's coalition arrives, expecting to crush a group of refugees," her smile turned sharp and cold and absolutely terrifying, "they'll face a unified force the likes of which hasn't existed since the First Covenant. We'll show them why our ancestors feared that alliance enough to destroy it." The council dissolved into organized chaos. People running to gather materials to study the Codex to prepare themselves mentally for what came next. Cale and Sarah worked through the night, translating the ritual, breaking it down into steps, identifying what could go wrong and how to prevent it. As dawn approached and Sarah had to retreat to the sanctum's shadows, Cale stood at the ruin's entrance, watching the sun rise, feeling her presence through the bond, even though she was deep underground. Their volunteers, human and vampire both, moved through the camp, preparing. And for the first time since this started, Cale felt something he hadn't expected. Hope. Not the fragile, desperate kind, but something stronger. Because they were choosing this. Choosing partnership over hatred. Choosing unity over division. Choosing to be the change they wanted to see. The gathering storm was coming. Let it come. They'd be ready. The circle was perfect. They'd spent an entire day preparing it. A ritual space 50 feet in diameter carved into the clearing before the ruins. Every symbol copied exactly from the Codex. Human and vampire had worked side by side, mixing mortar according to ancient recipes, placing stones with mathematical precision, channeling power into the formation, until it hummed with latent magic. 22 stones for 22 volunteers. 10 human Vampire pairs plus Kale and Seraph who would anchor the ritual. Each stone carved with personal symbols. Each position carefully calculated to balance human and vampire energies. Now, as the sun set on the second day, as the new moon began its rise, barely visible, a shadow against shadows, the volunteers took their places. Human and vampire pairs stood facing each other, hands clasped, fear and determination wearing on every face. Kale and Sarah stood at the circle center, the codex open before them on a stone pedestal, its pages glowing with inner light. Through their bond, Kale felt Sarada's nervousness. She'd led armies, commanded thousands in battle. But this was different. This required creation, not destruction. And she was terrified of failing, of destroying these brave souls who trusted her. You can do this, Kale sent through the bond, wrapping her in certainty, in love, in absolute faith. We can do this together. Sarah took a breath, squared her shoulders, and began to chant. The words were ancient, predating kingdoms, predating written language, pulled from the codex and channeled through her voice. The ritual circle flared to life. Lines of light connecting stone to stone, human to vampire, creating a web of power that made the air shimmer like heat haze. Kale felt it through the bond, the magic flowing through Seraph, using their connection as a channel reaching out to the other pairs. And because he was bonded to her, because his blood carried her essence, he became part of the ritual too, his human energy mixing with her vampire power, creating something that was neither both. The volunteers gasped as the magic hit them, their ritual symbols flaring, the space between paired human and vampire beginning to glow. They gripped each other's hands tighter, fighting through the discomfort, the fear, the fundamental wrongness of having another soul press against yours. Don't resist, Sarah called out, her voice strained but steady. Let the magic flow. Trust your partner. Trust the covenant. Trust that you're stronger together than apart. One by one, the pairs began to merge. Not physically. They remained separate beings, but spiritually, energetically, their auras blending until it was impossible to tell where human ended and vampire began. The circle blazed brighter, power building exponentially as each successful pairing fed the whole. Kale watched through enhanced senses as Marcus, the soldier, who'd volunteered first, merged with Liara, the ancient vampire. Their joined form radiated power. Marcus' humanity tempering Liara's predatory nature. Liara's centuries of experience flowing into Marcus' tactics. They opened their eyes together, gasped together, and their expressions held wonder. I can feel the sun, Liara whispered, tears streaming down her face through him. I can feel sunlight. I'd forgotten how warm it feels. I can see centuries. Marcus breathed. Every battle she's fought, every strategy. It's all there, available. I understand combat now in ways I never. Oh God, this is incredible. The other pairs completed their merging. Some easily, some with struggle, but all successful until only one remained. Young human woman named Sarah and an older vampire named Thedawn. They stood at their stone, hands clasped, they ritual magic swirling around them, but not completing. Their connection flickered, unstable, threatening to collapse. I can't, Sarah gasped, her voice panicked. I can't do it. He has memories. He's killed so many. I can feel the blood. I'm sorry, Thedawn whispered, his ancient face twisted with shame. I'm sorry for every death, every life I took. I can't change what I was. I can only. No. Sarah's voice cut through their panic like a blade. She moved to them, Kale right behind her, their bond blazing bright enough that everyone could see it, not just those with supernatural senses, but ordinary human eyes, too. A golden crimson thread connecting mortal and immortal. Sarah, look at me. Thedawn, you too. They did. Tears streaming down both faces. Red from the vampire, clear from the human. I've killed thousands, Sarah said quietly, fiercely. More than the will ever kill in his entire existence. I led armies, burned cities, made the night run red for centuries. And I carry every death, every face, every scream. It's a weight that never lightens, never fades. She took Sarah's hand, placed it over her own heart. But Cale accepted me anyway, not because he excused what I did, but because he saw what I'm trying to become. He saw the person struggling to emerge from the weapon, and he chose to help her, to love her despite everything. She moved Sarah's hand to Thedawn's chest, placed it over his silent heart, that didn't choose what he was made to be. But he's here now, trying to be better, trying to build instead of destroy. That's what you merge with. Not his past, but his choice. Just as he merges with yours. Sarah looked at the wren, really looked, and through the flickering connection, Cale could see her perception shift. Seeing not a monster who'd killed, but a person who was trying desperately to atone. And Thedawn, feeling her judgment transform into understanding, let out a sob of relief. Their connection stabilized, blazed bright, completed. The ritual circle erupted with power. Cale staggered as the full weight of 11. Joined pairs fed their energy into the formation, using him and Sarah as anchors, as channels, as the living embodiment of what the unity rite represented. Through the bond, he felt Sarah struggling to control the flow, to shape it, to direct it into the patterns the CEX demanded. Help me, she gasped. Through their connection. I can't hold it all. I need. Cale didn't hesitate. He opened himself fully to the bond. Let his human resilience and adaptability flow into her. Gave her his strength, his determination, his utter conviction that this would work. And Sarah, drawing on that support, that partnership, shaped the ritual magic with precision that would have been impossible alone. The circle completed. Light exploded outward, washing over every person present, sealing the unity bonds, locking them in place. When it faded, the volunteers stood changed. Still themselves, still separate but more enhanced, unified. A human vampire coalition the likes of which hadn't existed since the First Covenant era. Sarah collapsed and Cale caught her, lowering them both to the ground, feeling her exhaustion through the bond. The ritual had drained her, burned through centuries of stored power, but her expression held triumph. We did it, she whispered. We actually did it. Of course we did, Cale replied, smiling despite his own exhaustion. We howls erupted from the forest. Not the bloodbound's chaotic screaming, but organized, disciplined signals. War howls, the kind that announced an approaching army. Sir's coalition had arrived. They came with the darkness. 3 vampire clans united under a single banner. Their combined force sweeping through the bloodpine thicket. Like a tide of shadow and death. 200 fighters, maybe more, bloodbound and vampires and human mercenaries who'd sold their souls for gold and the promise of vampire blood. At their head rode 3 vampire lords, Shriya's former lieutenants, ancient and powerful and absolutely confident in their victory. They'd crushed rebellions before, snuffed out hope with casual brutality, enforced the old order for centuries. They expected to find a terrified group of refugees. Instead, they found a unified force, waiting in perfect formation. The 11 pairs stood in defensive positions around the ruins, each duo moving with preternatural coordination, human and vampire thinking as one, fighting as one. Behind them, Cale and Sarah stood at the ruins' entrance, the dawn blade at Sarada's belt, Cale's bow strung and ready. The coalition army stopped at the clearing's edge. their leaders riding forward on horses corrupted by vampire blood. Animals with red eyes and 2 sharp teeth, mounts as monstrous as their riders. The center, Lord, a vampire named Dven, who'd served Sir for 8 centuries, called out, his voice carrying effortlessly across the distance. Sarah the Fallen, traitor to your kind, destroyer of the natural order. His smile was cold, amused. We've come to rectify your continued existence. Surrender and we'll make your death swift. Your mortal pet too. The others, he gestured dismissively at the 20 volunteers, will be given the chance to return to their proper places. Thraz. For the humans. Eternal servitude for the vampires who've forgotten their place. I have a counteroffer, Sarah called. Back. Through the bond, Kale felt her absolute calm, her warrior's focus, sliding into place like a well-worn coat. Leave now. Abandon Sritha's failed regime. Abandon the old hatreds, and we'll let you live to see the new order we're building. Stay and you'll learn why the first covenant terrified your ancestors so much they destroyed it. Dven laughed, and the sound was shared by his fellow lords by the army behind them. 11 pairs of barely trained rebels against 200 veterans. You've lost your tactical mind along with your loyalty. Seraph. This will be a slaughter. Yes. Seraph agreed. It will. She raised her hand and the unity pairs moved. They struck like lightning, coordinated, devastating, impossibly fast. The human-vampire mergers granted abilities neither side could achieve alone. Vampires who could operate in the bright moonlight without weakness. Humans who moved with supernatural speed and strength. Marcus and Lara hit the left flank. Their combined 800 years of combat experience making them unstoppable. Marcus' tactical flexibility paired with Liara's raw power. Sarah and the Run took the right. Their newly forged trust making their bond even stronger, more adaptable. Sarah wielded weapons with vampire strength. The fought with human unpredictability, and together they cut through the coalition's lines like a blade through silk. The other pairs followed, each finding their rhythm, their strengths, their unique combination of mortal creativity and immortal power. And at the center, Kale and Sarah anchored them all. Kale had never been a warrior. He'd been a hunter, a survivor, someone who avoided fights rather than seeking them. But through the bond, Sarah's 800 years of combat mastery flowed into him, not controlling him but supporting him, whispering tactics, highlighting weaknesses, showing him how to move, where to strike. His arrows flew with preternatural accuracy, each one finding eyes or throats or the small gaps in blood-bound armor. When enemies got too close, he fought with his grandfather's sword enhanced by vampire strength, moving in patterns Sarah showed him. Through their connection, their minds working in perfect harmony. And Sarah was magnificent. She fought with the Dawn blade, and though it wasn't powered by sacrifice, the Covenant weapon still cut through vampire defenses like ordinary steel through flesh. She moved through the enemy ranks like a force of nature, her commands directing the unity pairs, her presence rallying the volunteers, her every movement precise and deadly. But they were still outnumbered. 10-to-1 odds, even with unity enhancement, were brutal. The coalition army pressed from all sides, and slowly, inevitably, the defenders were driven back toward the ruins. A bloodbounds. Claws ran across Kale's ribs, opening deep wounds that burned with poison. He gasped, falling to one knee, and felt Sarada's panic through the bond, but also felt her control. She didn't abandon tactics to save him. Instead, she sent calm certainty through their connection and directed Marcus Liara to cover his position while she maintained the formation's integrity. The pair responded instantly, their merged fighting style creating a defensive barrier that let Kale catch his breath. Let the unity bond's enhanced healing begin to close his wounds. We can't hold, Marcus called out, his voice blending with Lyra's in an eerie harmony. They're too many. We've killed 50, maybe more, but they keep coming. Dven, watching from the rear, laughed. Do you see now, Sarah? Your covenant magic is impressive, but numbers always win. Always. Surrender. Annis. An arrow took him. Through the throat. Not Kale's arrow. He was still recovering from the bloodbound attack. This came from behind the coalition army from the forest, and it was followed by dozens more, a rain of projectiles that punched through vampire flesh and bloodbound armor. From the trees emerged an impossible sight. Humans and vampires together, maybe 40 strong, wearing a mix of civilian clothing and battered armor. At their head, an elderly human woman with a face Sarah recognized instantly through the bond. The elder from Grey Home, the child she'd saved a century ago, now whizzed with age, but alive, thriving. The city of Grey Home, the woman called out, her voice carrying despite her years, does not forget its debts. You spared us, Sarah the merciful. Now we spare you. She raised her sword, ceremonial but real, and behind her, the mixed force of human and vampire volunteers charged into the coalition's rear. They weren't unity bonded. They weren't coordinated or particularly skilled, but they were determined. And their arrival broke the coalition's momentum, forced Driven to split his forces to handle the new threat. Grey Home remembers the elder screamed, driving her blade into a bloodbound's back. The Warbride who chose mercy, the vampire who said no. We remember and we stand with her. The battle descended into chaos. Coalition forces surrounded, caught between Sarah as unity pairs on one side and Grey Home's volunteers on the other. And in that chaos, Sarah saw her opening. She sent urgent impressions through the bond to the unity pairs, showed them the maneuver she planned, felt their instant understanding and agreement. Then she looked at Kale, and through their connection, shared a final message. I love you. If this fails, if I don't survive, you'll survive. Kale sent back fiercely. Well, survive. Together. Sarah smiled, fierce and bright and moved. She broke from the formation, running not away from the enemy, but toward them, specifically toward Dven and the other 2 vampire lords. The dawn blade blazed in her hand, covenant magic recognizing her intent, her willingness to sacrifice, her determination to end this. Dven saw her coming, raised his own weapon, a sword forged from vampire bones and mortal suffering, and met her charged with confidence born from 8 centuries of victory. They clashed in the center of the battlefield, and the impact sent shockwaves across the clearing, made the very air ripple. Sarah fought with everything she had. 800 years of skill against 800 years of cruelty. And they were matched. Perfectly, impossibly matched until Kale's arrow punched through Dven's shoulder from behind. The vampire lord stumbled, his guard dropping for just a fraction of a second, long enough for Sarah to drive the dawn blade through his chest. Not deep enough to kill, but deep enough to hurt, deep enough for the covenant weapon to begin its work. The old order is over, Sarah said, quietly, her face inches from Dven's as vampire lord struggled and failed to break her grip. Not because you're weak, but because unity will always triumph over division, because partnership beats domination, because the future belongs to those who can change. She pulled the blade out and Dven collapsed. Not dead but weakened, his power bleeding away through the covenant wound. The other 2 vampire lords, seeing their leader fall, seeing the impossible, a mixed human-vampire force winning against overwhelming odds, made a choice. They fled. Not just them. Their armies, too. The coalition dissolving as soldiers realized the cause was lost, that the legends about The First Covenant's power were true. They fled into the forest into the night, leaving their wounded and dead behind. The battle was over. The clearing fell silent except for breathing, harsh from the humans, shallow from the vampires, labored from Kale, who was bleeding from a dozen wounds. But they were alive. Impossibly, miraculously, they were alive. The Greyhome elder approached slowly, supported by younger volunteers, and stopped before Seraph. She looked up at the vampire who'd spared her city, who'd chosen mercy when cruelty was expected, and tears streamed down her weathered face. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving me a life to live, for giving my children and grandchildren a future. We came as soon as we heard you needed aid." Sarah, legendary war bride, destroyer of armies, breaker of clans, fell to her knees before this mortal woman and wept tears of red and silver. "Thank you," she managed through sobs. "Thank you for remembering, for believing that mercy matters, for proving that she couldn't finish." Overcome with emotion, the elder placed a weathered hand on Sarada's head. "A blessing from mortal to immortal. You are forgiven. All of it. The past, the blood, the sorrow. You are forgiven. And you are welcome always." And in that moment, in that clearing filled with humans and vampires who'd fought together and survived together, something profound shifted. Not just tactically, not just politically, but spiritually. The new covenant wasn't just words. It was real, built in blood, and tears and impossible trust. Kale, watching through the bond, felt Sarada's centuries of guilt begin to crack, to fracture, to let light seep through. Felt her beginning to believe, truly believe, that redemption might not be a fairy tale after all. He limped to her, knelt beside her, and together they held each other while the survivors cheered, while vampire and human embraced as equals, while the impossible became reality. The long night was over. The dawn was coming. In the aftermath, they counted the cost. 12 dead from the Unity pairs and Greyhome volunteers, 7 humans, 5 vampires fallen. Defending the new covenant, they buried the humans in the forest, planting trees over their graves as markers. The vampires they cremated according to old custom, scattering their ashes in the sanctum where covenant magic would keep their memory alive. Sarah spoke the eulogy, her voice rough with grief and gratitude, and everyone, human and vampire, both bowed their heads in respect. For the first time in living memory, immortal and mortal dead were honored equally. But the victory, costly as it was, had changed everything. Word spread faster than wildfire, carried by the fleeing coalition forces, by Greyhome volunteers returning home by messenger birds and whispered conversations. The fallen Warbride and her mortal consort had defeated 3 vampire clans using First Covenant magic. Unity bonds worked. Partnership between human and vampire wasn't just possible, it was powerful. In human kingdoms, lords who'd spent generations fighting vampires began to reconsider. Maybe there was another way. Maybe not all night walkers were monsters. In vampire courts, younger lords who chafed under ancient tyrants like Sir Opportunity. If the old order could be broken, if a new covenant could be built, perhaps they could escape the endless cycles of blood feuds and territorial wars. Change was coming. Inevitable. Unstoppable. Terrifying change. But first, they had to deal with Sir. He returned a week after the battle. Not with an army, not with threats or ultimatums. He simply walked out of the forest at twilight, alone and unarmed, moving with the uncertainty of someone who'd forgotten how to be anything but powerful. The Unity pairs immediately formed defensive positions, weapons raised, but Sarah held up a hand, stopping them. Through the bond, Kale felt her curiosity mixing with weariness. This wasn't an attack. It was something else. Sir approached slowly, stopping at the edge of the clearing while outside. Striking range. In the week since they'd cut him off from his bloodline, he changed. Not physically, his beauty remained eternal and terrible. But something in his bearing was different. Diminished, almost mortal. "I didn't come to fight," he said, his voice lacking its usual command, its absolute confidence. "I came to understand, to see what you've built here." He looked around at the mixed camp, at humans and vampires working side by side, and his expression was unreadable. "They say you've forged unity bonds, that you've recreated the first covenants. Magic, that you defeated Dven and 2 other lords with a force 1/10 their size." "It's true," Sarah said quietly, not approaching but not retreating either. "The Codex was real. The magic was real, and it works. Sir, everything we were taught about humans being inferior, about domination being the only viable relationship, it's all lies. Partnership is stronger. Unity is stronger." Sir flinched as if she'd struck him. "And where does that leave me?" His voice was smaller now, almost childlike. "I built an empire on those lies. Shaped a Warbride, shaped you to enforce them. If it's all false, if the foundation was rotten, then what was the point? What were 800 years of my existence for?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "I've asked myself the same question for a century. What was the point of all that death, all that suffering? And the only answer I found is," she paused, choosing words carefully, "the point is what we do now. We can't undo the past, but we can choose the future." "I have no future." Sir's laugh was bitter, broken. "You severed my bloodline connection. I'm isolated, weakened. The vampire lords who once feared me now mock me. I'm a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when you let mortals weaken you." "So start over," Cale said, surprising himself by speaking. Everyone turned to look at him. This mortal, this human who bound himself to a vampire who'd aged decades fighting ancient enemies, who somehow had survived everything the night could throw at him. "You're right. You can't go back to being what you were. But maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe it's a chance to discover who you are without the power, without the empire, without centuries of accumulated cruelty." "You think I can redeem myself?" Sitha's voice was scathing, but beneath the scorn, Cale heard desperate hope. "I've killed thousands, tortured more, destroyed Sarada's humanity, and remade her into a weapon. You think I can just start over? Say sorry and be forgiven?" "No," Cale said honestly. "Saying sorry isn't enough, but trying to be better might be. It worked for Sarah. It's working for every vampire here who's chosen partnership over predation. Why not you?" Sir stared at him at this mortal who should be prey, but somehow spoke with authority, with certainty, with the confidence of someone who'd survived impossible things. "You're either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid." "Both," Cale agreed cheerfully. "That seems to be my defining characteristic. Despite everything, despite centuries of hatred, despite betrayals and battles and blood," Sarah laughed. Really laughed. Bright and clear. And after a moment, several of the unity pairs joined her, the sound echoing across the clearing. Sir looked at them, at Seraph, laughing freely for maybe the first time in 800 years, and something in his perfect, terrible face broke. "I don't know how to be anything but what I am," he whispered. "I don't know how to live without power, without control, without the bloodline connection that's defined my existence for 2 millennia. I'm lost, Sarah. For the first time since I was turned, I'm truly terribly lost." Sarada's laughter faded. She approached him slowly, and Cale felt through the bond her wearing emotions. Hatred for what he'd done to her, pity for what he'd become, and underneath it all, a tiny, fragile hope that maybe even ancient monsters could change. Then let us help you, she said quietly. Not forget, well, never forget. But maybe move forward together. Build something new from the ashes of the old. Why? Sarah's voice broke. After everything I did to you, why would you offer mercy? Because Sarah said, simply, someone showed me mercy first. And I learned that it's contagious. That it spreads like fire if you let it. That it's the most revolutionary act possible to refuse to perpetuate the cycles of cruelty, to choose compassion even when vengeance would be easier. She held out her hand. Not in friendship. They were too broken for that. But in possibility, in the chance to try. Sir stared at her hand for a long moment. 2,000 years of pride, of absolute power, of never bowing to anyone, weared with a week of isolation, of powerlessness, of discovering that immortality without purpose was just extended dying. Finally, slowly, he took her hand. The camp erupted in whispers, shock and anger from some, hope from others. But Sarah held firm, and through the bond Cale supported her, sensed certainty that this was right, that mercy without limits was the only way to truly break the cycles. You'll work, Sarah said. Firmly. Not led, not command. Work. Alongside humans, alongside vampires you once considered beneath you. You'll rebuild what you've destroyed. And if you ever slip, if you ever try to reclaim your old power through cruelty. The dawn blade flashed at her belt, a silent promise. I'll finish what we started permanently. Sir nodded, unable to speak. This ancient vampire lord reduced to grateful silence by the unexpected gift of a second chance. As he was led away by unity pairs who would watch him, teach him, force him to learn partnership instead of domination, Cale moved to Sarath's side. That was either the wisest thing you've ever done or the stupidest, he said quietly. Both. Sarah agreed, mirroring his earlier words. But mercy without risk isn't mercy. It's just self-serving kindness. Real mercy, the kind that changes worlds, has to be dangerous, has to be stupid, has to be the choice no one expects. Through the bond, Cale felt her exhaustion, not physical but spiritual. The weight of centuries lifting being replaced by the equally heavy weight of hope. Are you okay? He asked. I don't know, Seraph admitted. For 800 years, I knew who I was. Weapon, Warbride, monster trying to atone. Now I'm something else. Leader may be a symbol. The fallen Warbride who rose again, who built a new covenant from the ashes of the old. And I don't know if I'm strong enough to be that. Cale took her hand, warm and cold, intertwined. You're not alone. That's the point. Remember, you don't have to be strong enough by yourself. We are partners. All of us, he gestured at the camp, at the unity pairs, at the mixed community they were building. We carry this together. Sarah leaned into him and they stood together, watching the sun set, watching the stars emerge, watching the world turn on its axis. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Human kingdoms to negotiate with, vampire courts to convince, ancient prejudices to overcome. But tonight they had this peace, hard won and fragile, built on impossible trust and dangerous mercy. The dawn blade at Sarada's belt pulsed with warm light, covenant magic, recognizing what they'd built, blessing it. A new age was beginning and they would face it together. 3 months later the world had changed. Not completely. Centuries of hatred couldn't be erased in a season, but changed enough that hope had become something more than desperate fantasy. Had become policy. The first official treaty was signed in neutral territory, a meadow that belonged to neither human kingdom nor vampire court, witnessed by unity pairs and sealed with mixed blood, human and vampire together. It was called the New Covenant, and it established rules. No unauthorized feeding, no slavery, mortal or immortal. No territorial expansion through violence. Instead, cooperation. Trade, mixed patrols in border regions where bloodbound and other monsters still prowled. It was imperfect, riddled with compromises that satisfied no one completely. But it was real. More. Unity bonds were formed carefully. Slowly, with proper ritual and preparation. 20 pairs became 50. 50 became 100. Each bond a testament that partnership was possible, that the old divisions could be overcome. And at the center of it all, Sarah and Cale, the first bond, the anchor, the living proof that mortal and immortal could not just coexist, but thrive together. They stood now on the ruin's highest point, the same place where Cale had first found Sarah bleeding in the snow, where everything had started. The forest below had changed, too. The blood pine thicket's darkness had lifted slightly, as if the land itself responded to the New Covenant's magic. Grey Home sent another delegation, Cale reported, reading from a letter that had arrived that morning. They want to establish a permanent embassy here. Mixed staff, humans and vampires working together, serving as mediators for other cities interested in the treaty. We'll need to expand the ruins, Sarah mused. Build proper structures. Maybe even a town eventually, a place where both kinds can live openly without fear. She smiled at the impossibility of it. We're going to need architects, teachers, diplomats. I have no idea how to build a town. Good thing you have partners, Cale said, pulling her close. Through the bond, he felt her contentment mixing with lingering anxiety. She still didn't fully believe this was real, that it would last, that somehow it wouldn't all crumble back into violence and hatred. He understood. He carried his own doubts. But they faced them together, and somehow that made them bearable. How are you feeling? Sarah asked, her hand coming up to touch his face. He was aging slowly now, the unity bond slowing his mortal decay, granting him decades, maybe a century or more. His hair had gone fully gray from the Dawnblade's price. His face showed the lines of someone in their 60s, but his body remained strong, enhanced by vampire essence. Good, Cale said honestly. Different, but good. He paused, thinking of his wife, of the life he'd had before plague and isolation. I miss who I was. But I don't regret who I've become. Neither do I, Sarah whispered. You gave me back my humanity, my hope, my reason to believe redemption was possible. I'll spend the next 800 years trying to be worthy of that gift. You already are, Cale said firmly. They stood together watching the sunset, a ritual they developed. This moment of peace before twilight brought the night's responsibilities. Seraph couldn't step into sunlight still, but through the bond she experienced it. Felt the warmth on Cale's skin, saw the colors through his eyes. There's news from the deep ruins, Sarah said. Eventually, the Codex has been responding to our use of its magic, growing, updating as if it's alive and learning. Liera thinks it might be trying to communicate about the old dark. Cale asked, feeling a chill despite the sunset's warmth. Maybe, probably. The Codex was created to fight them, to seal them away. If the seal is weakening, Sarada's voice tightened with worry. We might be building a covenant just in time to face the original enemy, the one that forced humans and vampires together in the first place. Then we'll face it, Cale said simply, together, the way we've faced everything else. It could destroy us, Sarah warned. The old dark isn't like vampire lords or human kingdoms. It's older, primordial, beyond our understanding. Then we'll expand our understanding. Kale countered. We have the Codex. We have unity bonds. We have humans and vampires working together, combining our strengths. If the original Covenant defenders could seal the old dark away, we can keep it sealed or fight it if necessary. Sarah looked at him, at this mortal who'd aged decades for her, who bound his soul to hers, who faced the potential end of the world with determination instead of despair. When did you become so optimistic? When I met a vampire who taught me that change is possible, Kale replied. That, even after 800 years of darkness, dawn can still come. Below them the community stirred. Humans and vampires ending their day shifts, beginning their night patrols, cooking meals, human food. For some, blood; for others, sustenance shared without judgment. Children played at the ruin's edge. Human kids who'd grown up knowing vampires as protectors rather than monsters. It was small, fragile, but it was real. Do you think it will last? Sarah asked quietly. This peace we've built. Or will it crumble like the first Covenant, destroyed by fear and hatred? I don't know, Kale admitted. Maybe it'll last centuries. Maybe just decades. Maybe tomorrow some ancient vampire or paranoid human lord will shatter everything we've built. He turned to face her fully, his weathered hands framing her eternally young face. But we'll have tried. We'll have proven it's possible. And even if we fail, even if this all comes crashing down, someone will remember. Someday someone else will try again. That's how change works. Slowly, one impossible act at a time. Sarah kissed him then, deep and certain, and through the bond they shared everything, hope and fear, love and doubt, mortal warmth and immortal cold, blending into something neither and both. When they broke apart, the sun had set fully, stars emerging in the darkening sky. Sarah's time, and through their bond, Kale's time too. He was as much creature of night as day now, comfortable in both worlds, belonging fully to neither and both. Whatever comes, Sarah said, her voice carrying the weight of centuries and the lightness of hope, we face it together. No more running, no more hiding. We stand and we build and we fight for this. She gestured at the community below, at the impossible peace they'd created. Because if we don't, who will? Together. Kale agreed. The word that had become their promise, their vow, their entire philosophy distilled to one concept. They descended from the ruins hand in hand, returning to their community, to the endless work of building a new covenant, to the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, the cycles of hatred could finally be broken. Behind them, the dawn blade rested in its place of honor in the sanctum, covenant magic pulsing through its blade, waiting. Above, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to mortal and immortal struggles, watching as a new age struggled to be born. And somewhere far below, in places sealed away from light and time, the old dark stirred in its sleep, feeling the covenant magic strengthening, feeling the bonds between human and vampire multiplying. And it began slowly to wake, but that was a battle for another day. For now, there was peace. Hard-won, blood-bought, impossibly fragile peace. And two souls. One mortal, one immortal, both changed beyond recognition, faced it together, determined to build a world where mercy triumphed over hatred, where partnership overcame division, where love proved stronger than the darkness that had reigned for millennia. The crimson dawn had come, and with it hope.